Wind had many tongues in the south. It hissed between broken teeth of rock. It carried the dust like old secrets and stung the skin with them. It combed low blue scrub and sighed as if the hills themselves were breathing. She had learned to listen to wind, to instructions that did not come in words, which way it asked her to lean, which fold of the land would hide her shape, what scent it dragged along from far beyond the next rise. In the morning it smelled of cool stone and spikenard and water buried somewhere beneath the thirsty mantle of the world. By noon it was metal, salt from dried sweat, and the warm animal thought of her pony. Toward evening it turned thin and rattling, and sometimes a strand of desert music rode it, someone far away plucking at strings. Arya let the reins go lax and pressed her hand to the neck of the animal so it could feel her gratitude. The pony moved like a river in drought, cautious, picking its way among stones, patient with the quiet. She traveled alone because it was simpler to move alone, and because in the places she had walked, companionship could mean a name, and a name could mean a door she was not ready to open. Yet alone did not mean empty. She had ghosts at her shoulders and a small blade sleeping against her hip, a slender length of steel that had eaten so many stars in the night when she polished it that sometimes she thought she could taste night on her tongue. She knew the weight of the blade and the scale of the ghosts and the measure of her hunger and how many sips of water to allow herself before she must stop at a shadow and count her breath until thirst became simply another part of the day. When the gulls arrived, they surprised her. She had wondered if she was mishearing the wind, but then a white flash tumbled across the cloudless vault and turned on a blade of sun and hollered without shame at the empty stone. The sound made her smile without meaning to. The only water for days had been a string of shallow pans beneath an overhang where the night seeped down as dew, and the pony had lipped them dry. But gulls meant something was near. Fish, route, people. A road bending toward a hidden coast where someone had once said the sea was not blue but a belt of beaten steel. Arya stood in the stirrups and shaded her eyes and watched 3 gulls turn again and again above a cut in the hills like the mouth of a cave. She left the gift of her breath to the pony's ear and slid down and let it, boots finding their own way. Sand made a crust, then it broke and revealed older rock beneath, rock with plum bruises and white veins. The cut opened into a narrow slot and the slot breathed cooler. Water was not the only thing it promised. She had learned too many times that cool could hide hot hands. A quiet place was a trap when you did not know whose quiet it was. But the pony lifted its head and tugged. Its nostrils flared and hummed. Arya listened and heard the gulls again, and then a different voice, deeper, a rush she had not heard in many weeks. The sound of a river contained, because if it were larger it would sing out. This was the private breath of a stream. The slot widened. There were pale pearled pebbles underfoot and a few sycamores. Their roots wound on the surface like cords. Moss made velvet teeth on stone. The gulls were there, gaunt and greedy, stepping like little priests in pale robes, heads jerking, and they shrieked when they saw her but did not leave the pool. On one side an arc of water spilled from a lip and hammered the rock in a steady thread. Beneath it, half in sun and half in shade, a man was sitting with his back to her. His shirt clung where the water had rinsed it. He had hung a pale scabbard across a root. He was sharpening a piece of wood with a knife as if all the world were his kitchen, and he was content to begin here and end here and no other place existed. Arya stopped in the trees and let her eyes eat the scene piece by piece. The scabbard was good work, pale leather, star-bright bosses, old but tended. The knife in his hand was not a kitchen knife. His shoulders were not narrow. He had taken off his boots and the soles of his feet were tough brown. He did not turn. She could smell something else then, under the smell of cool water, a smell like snow remembered with accuracy and stored inside a cedar chest for a long time. The wind did not bring that scent here. It rose from the man or the sword across the root or from her own head, a trick of hunger for the thing that scent named. She did not speak. She put her hand to the pony's muzzle, and it knew the hand and went quiet. A dragonfly tracked a bright line in the sun and landed on the edge of a leaf. She counted the beats of her heart to 30 and looked again. The man's hair was mostly gray and cut short. The muscles of his neck agreed with his shoulders. Nothing superfluous. When he spoke, it was not because of anything she had done. You'll find the left bank deeper, he said. For the horse. She moved her eyes to his face before she moved her feet, but the face told her nothing yet. He did not turn. Perhaps the sound of her boots, then the sound of the animal's breath, had been enough. She led the pony to the left, walking in until the water took her ankles and then her calves, and the cold made her teeth come together. The pony went willingly, neck stretched, and drank, as if the cold were not a problem but the answer. It's not water I came for. Her own voice sounded different here, more honest, or more like something she had abandoned and was picking up again, like a scarf found on a hedge after winter. No. He set the wood down and laid the knife beside it. Then your horse will be happy, at least. We all have days when the horse is luckiest of us. She let the pony drink and breathe, and as she stood in the rivulet, she felt the stream touching her skin like a hand she did not want to shake off. It was the first gentle thing to touch her in weeks. This is your place? It is the water's place. I am borrowing it. He turned then, at last, and his eyes were not soft or hard. They were decisive. He was older, but there are years that sharpen and years that sand a person down, and his had done both in different places. He considered the world as if it might still offer a surprise. His mouth made a smile that was only 1/3 a smile and 2/3 the acknowledgement that smiles were currency and must be spent carefully. You can borrow too. I have borrowed all my life, Arya said. Sometimes even a name. She did not like how the second part had come out of her without invitation. But he did not flinch at the word. His gaze went to the little blade at her hip, the borrowed name she refused to let go of. Well then, perhaps time to repay a little. I repay with work. She glanced at the scabbard across the root again. It was not her first time looking. There was something in the pale leather that insisted. Too big for her. Too known for the South. She had seen men in 100 towns who called themselves something important and wore a sword like a song they were proud to keep singing. But this was not a song. This was stone-made instrument. She kept her eyes from it and then returned them to it and then to his hands. Work is honest. His thumbs ran along the wood he had been carving. It was a simple stick, already smooth with the kind of patient attention that does not need an outcome. Work tells you what you are worth, or what you can bear. That too. He paused. You have walked a long way from something. Maybe I am walking toward instead. Does it matter? She wanted to keep the words light, to leave them on the surface like the bloom that floats away, but they sank the moment she said them, and she knew he felt the weight. It matters, but not yet. He stood, and water made his shirt transparent against a chest that had stacked work on work without complaining. He picked up the pale scabbard, but not to put the sword on. He lifted it with the respect you would give a sleeping animal and set it against the tree, close to him. It was a caution or a reflex. She watched and did not pretend not to watch. I haven't asked your name. Her tongue was quick, and she had learned to cut with it much as with steel. Names were a kind of blade. To wield them, you had to know if the edge pointed in or out. No, he said. He draped the damp shirt over a rock and took another, dry. It was mended at the shoulder with even small stitches. But you know one of them. How could I? She was tired and the word came out like flint against flint. You're from a place that reads history in the shape of a sword. He did not smile now. And the gulls told me you would be stubborn. Gulls tell stories? She almost laughed. They only argue about fish. They argue about everything. Just now they argued that you would stand over there in the trees with your hand on the horse's face and pretend you were just thirsty. The collar on his shirt turned, showing the inner seam. He had the hands of a person who had cared for a blade, but also for bread, for thread, for the plain things that make a life balanced and quiet when no one is trying to end you. She was not used to seeing both. If I say a name, she said, and it is the wrong one, we are enemies. If I say the right name, we might be enemies too. Names have weather. He pulled the shirt over his head and shook himself into it. Some must be wintered before they can be spoken without frostbite. She let silence thicken with the sound of water until it did the courtesy of breaking for them. You can call me Arya. He nodded as if she had confirmed something he had balanced in his palm the whole time. And you may call me a man who owes more than I can repay in this life. If that is too long for you, there is another. Ignore me then if you like. I am troublesome. HM. He relaxed the shoulder that had not wished to relax. I could say I am Arthur. If I did, the gulls would stop arguing and go quiet and look at the sword. You would have 10 new questions and an old one that is not a question at all. The name walked across the slot like a stag coming down from a high wood. It was an old beauty, antlers burned by the sun, weight in every step. It made Arya's breath go short and then longer. She put a hand on the pony again because something must be anchored. Arthur, she said, and the place took the word as water takes a drop of rain. It did not reject it or suck it up greedily, it just made it belong. Sir Arthur Dayne. If you like. His face did not ask for a change. But leave off the sir. It is a coat I cannot wear, not even in memory. Then Arthur, she said again, and the word was blunt now and human. She had not thought ever to meet him. He belonged to a world of stories told after the lamps were put out and someone said, just one more, just this one, you must hear about the man whose sword could call dawn into stone. If she had been a different person, she would have told the wind to hurry, to bring him out of what he had been and place him in front of her as a fable. But she was not that person anymore, and he was not a fable. Do you want me to leave? She asked. It was not humility. It was a knife offered handle first. If I wanted that, you would have left. He took up the carved stick and examined the end, trimmed it again. He put the knife away at the small of his back. Eat. Then tell me what you thought you were walking toward. They drank first because water is the first food and often the last. He had a bundle with dried dates in it and a twist of goat's cheese with herbs, and she reached into her own and brought out 2 flat cakes wrapped in cloth so clean the cloth was an event. They sat with their backs to the same tree and ate without speech until the first sharpness of hunger receded and the second, subtler appetite made itsy. LF known. The appetite that sometimes felt like grief and sometimes like the lightness that comes after you have cried out everything you have and nothing remains but a cool plain of breath. The gulls argued. The stream kept its private wisdom. The pony allowed itself the luxury of closing its eyes between bites of grass. I came from far north of here, Arya said finally, as if it were not an obvious and bitter sentence. From a house that asks something of its children and gives much to them and takes much from them, sometimes without asking. I lost that house and learned how to live without it. Then I learned that I had not lost it, or that it had not lost me. Then I lost myself and learned again. I am walking toward a place where I may call what I have learned something other than the name others gave it. She followed her own words as if they were a track in the dust and tilted her head when she saw where they led. I am walking toward a name, not mine, but something like it. I need a sword for that name. Arthur listened. He did not interrupt or ask for clarity. He treated her words as a sheath treats a weapon, something he could hold and keep safe until it needed to be used again. There is a sword there, he said, not looking at the pale scabbard. But it is not yours, and I will not offer it to you. Could kill you even if you carried it in its scabbard. It might kill you especially then. I don't want a dead man's inheritance. Arya's eyes closed for a breath, opened. I want. What you want is not small. He raised a hand to his mouth, rubbed his lower lip with a knuckle. Names power my life as much as yours, though you might believe otherwise. The kind of sword you are seeking cannot be made in a forge alone. I know that. She set the tips of her fingers on the earth and pressed into it until her nails took a little dirt underneath, the way a tree might settle itself after a wind. There are weapons that are simply metal. Then there are weapons that are also promises. I do not know who taught you to speak that way. He was not derisive, but they taught you something worth having. He stood, stretched out one leg, then the other like a man after a long ride. I will not offer you a sword. I can offer you work. And if you pay with that, there may be a day when you can take up something you have made inside yourself and call it what you need to call it. What kind of work? The kind that catches morning on steel and demands we tell the truth, not to each other only, but but to our own hands." He picked up the stick he had been carving and planted it in the streambed where the current would not take it, and watched the water push and fail and push again. "You know some of it. I can see that. But you learned from shadows and I learned under the sun, and you could stand a little sun. We can do both if you are stubborn enough." "I am. I know." He finally took up the pale scabbard and looped it over his shoulder. He did not draw the sword. He moved as if drawing it would alter the air itself in a way rude to do in front of a stranger. "If you stay, we will wake when the stars are thin and the birds are not yet sure, and we will burn the old ways down to their metal and then see what remains." Arya did not consider for long. Some choices required ceremony. This one required only honesty. She tied the pony under the tree, patted its flank. "I will stay." For the first week, work had no voice and did not need one. Arthur woke before the gulls thought of arguing and lit a fire with only 2 small stones and patience. They walked to where the stream made a bed of slate and laid their feet on it to learn how slate might betray you, the way it pretended to be steady and then slid like a thought down a dangerous path. He made her step and step again, heel to toe, the balance point of hip shifting like the swing of a pendulum, until she cursed aloud at the mild trickery of the stone and then laughed at herself for cursing. He showed her the way a blade can disappear in sunlight if it moves at the right speed and angle. She showed him the way a blade can disappear in shadow if it is held long enough at the edge of a shadow. They did not argue about which was truer. The truth was the composite, and work has a way of making arguments unnecessary. She wore needle on her hip because it had become part of the hinge of her body, but she rarely drew it in the first week. Arthur took a long stick and set her to mirror him with one of equal length. He was adamant about the weight of the stick, as if an error of a few ounces would miseducate the muscles. He watched her grip, sometimes did not speak for a long time, then adjusted her thumb, the angle of the wrist, the place the palm met the wood. He tapped her elbow lightly when it crept upward and smiled when she could not keep the satisfaction off her face at developing a new habit. "When you hold a sword," he said, when day had warmed the rocks until the lizards believed in God, "you hold also a problem. It is a complicated animal. It wants to tell a story that is not your story. You must let it speak, but not for you. I think you mean to tell me that my sword is not me." Yes and no. He was not coy. He simply knew the words were not enough. The sword is a tool that takes some of your voice. It amplifies it, twists it if you are not careful. Sometimes even adds a note you did not know you could sing. But if you give it your story entire, it will own you, and men will hear the sword story when they speak of you after you are dead. I don't want their stories anyway. She burned a days-old annoyance at the notion that the world would stamp an image on her grave and thereafter call the image truth. But I will not be a knife that belongs to anyone else ever again. Then we begin correctly. Arthur pivoted and the stick became not a stick but the idea of a blade, cutting an arc that made a veil in the air. Here, there, is a way to step that gives you 3 answers at once. Watch. He stepped and she saw 3 things happen, and each of the 3 spoke to a different part of her, like a teacher who can praise and correct and command in one sentence. The front foot placed itself so that the weight would be between them, not hers and not the ground's. The hips turned so the shoulder became a shield, and the wrist softened so the blade could be the first to sense any change and report it to the remainder of the body. She nodded, tried it, failed in the way that feels like almost success, tried again and felt something reciprocal click in her bones. He nodded in return. Again, she said, and meant it. He cooked at night because he enjoyed measuring flour against water and making a flatbread so thin it caught fire on the edges and tasted of smoke. She watched him cut onions as if they were making a poem together. Decisive, consistent, the same number of strokes each time. He made broth that had learned patience. They ate slowly and cleaned everything afterward with the same seriousness they had put into footwork. The pony settled near, and once she looked up from a bowl to see Arthur's hand on the pony's forehead, a paternal blessing. He kept to his side of the fire when sleep claimed him and did not speak in sleep. Once, he woke in the black middle and sat up with his sword half drawn, then set it down with care and lay back and did not apologize in the morning and did not pretend nothing had happened. On the 8th day he drew the blade he had not drawn. He did not make a speech. He lifted it out with the smallest sound a blade could make, which was still not small because a blade wants to be noticed. The white of it was not the white of milk or chalk or bone. It was what you see when you close your eyes after you have looked at a star. His gauntlets were his hands. He did not wear them. He turned the blade in the sun and did not let the sun gild it. Some swords want the sun. This one convinced the sun to behave itself. Arya did not step closer. She did not reach. Her body held still because the animal ancestral inside her, the one that had kept the old ones alive on plains where teeth gleamed in grasses, knew that moving in the wrong way would be an offense. She let the sight come to her in a measured tide. She watched the edge and wondered if it cut the air merely by existing. "It is not for you," Arthur said again quietly. He was talking to himself as much as to her. "Not because you are unworthy, but because it is not the right answer for the question you are asking." "What question am I asking?" He half smiled again. "That is work. We will find it out." "Show me," she said, and was surprised by the humility in the asking. She was not accustomed to asking anyone to show her anything anymore. She was the one who showed, who took, who decided. But the blade made her honest. He showed her. He did not do what men do when they think they must break you with spectacle. He moved through 5 shapes you could have mistaken for children's game steps if you were a fool, and each shape birthed the next, and the space between the shapes felt like daylight between leaves. He did not step fast and he did not move slow. He was precise and entirely at ease. Weight went here then slid there. The shoulder made itself small. His breath was a metronome. He stopped as if he had concluded a syllable in a song, and did not bow, did not look to see if she had been watching. "Do it," he said. She stepped into the first shape. The stick in her hand became heavier, which was odd, because it had not become heavier. The muscles that had always sounded like soldiers eager for a fight quieted and listened for other orders. She moved into the second shape and felt the stick make a request. On the third shape, her left foot protested. She told it to be quiet, and it misunderstood quiet for collapse and gave way, and she caught herself with the edge of the stick and felt foolish and angry and relieved. In the fourth shape, tears came uninvited and stood in her eyes but did not fall. She moved into the fifth and felt something open in the chest, an unlatched door, and fear came 3 swift steps behind and tried to move her backward. She held still and the fear stopped because fear is a hunter and does not like prey that might also be a trap. Arthur said nothing for a long time, which was perfect. Then he said, "Again." And then he said nothing again. They did not speak for hours, and when the sun tilted and shadow made the slot into a long mouth of dusk, he made them stop, because stopping is part of work too. They ate and did not talk about the blade. On the next day, he brought a coil of rope and hung it from a branch and tied a heavy knot at the bottom of it and swung it. And she made herself step between the rope and the tree, and the knot passed within a breath of her hip and then where her head had been and then where her belly would have been if she had been slower, and she learned new things about not existing where harm intends to exist. She learned where not to be and how to get there without panic. On the day after that, he set a pot of water on the hottest part of the fire and ruined it, boiled it until it cracked. She looked at him, shocked by the waste, and he shrugged. It was already wanting to go. Better to do it now when we can watch it go. That is true of pots and people. He dug a hole and buried the fragments himself, then sat on the earth as if a friend had died and needed to be remembered properly. Sometimes, in the earliest black hour, she would wake and feel the desert watching the small circle of light they had made, and she would think of Winterfell and how heat could be a different kind of cold, how it could isolate you, and how something in her longed toward ash trees and ice-thin mornings and the kind of snow that refuses to dirty itself. She did not think of the house because the house would make her think of the head in the basket and the straw and the red that stained everything until her heart had to go blind not to see it constantly. She thought instead of small things, the way her father's hand was warm and a little calloused when he lifted her from a pony because she pretended to be asleep, the sound a wooden spoon makes when it touches a pot, Bran's laughter when he had seen the sky from where he should never have seen it and come back alive regardless. She allowed these things and did not apologize to anyone. The night stood guard over her indulgence in this human sweetness and made no comment. When she did speak of home, it was not to ask for pity. Arthur did not offer any. He offered something rarer. He remembered what she said and made each memory part of the work. When she told him she had learned to fight with one eye closed, he took a strip of cloth and made her close one and then the other and taught her how the body learns to lean. When she told him she had learned to pretend to be someone else in order to eat, he made her stand in front of him and be herself in order to strike. "There is only one person who will be there the next time you must make a choice," he said. "Even if you believe you have become another person, it will be you who lives with what the other has done. You must teach that one to be honest." She had known men like him in outline but not in fullness. He was not just the stories told about the blade he had carried. He was a quiet man who liked to sit with his feet in water and who cooked too much and then always found somewhere to put the second portion. He sometimes adjusted her grip with 2 fingers and then forgot and gripped his own memories too tight, and she could see him flinch from something not in the clearing, and then not flinch because he refused to be a slave to a past he had perhaps served too loyally. He did not ask for her story, but when it came, he held it, not like a prize but like a responsibility. In return, she did not ask for the names that haunted him. She recognized honor in the particular way he looked away from the direction in which his grief lived. Once they went to a market town 2 days' travel from the slot, so the pony could have his hoofs trimmed and a strap could be mended by a leatherworker who sang to his work. The town was full of heat and women with jars on their heads and a child who burned her tongue on a roasted fig and laughed anyway. No one looked at Arthur twice, which was instructive. We dress even our myths as men if we leave them unattended long enough in the crowd. He bought a clay jug with a narrow neck because he preferred the way the water poured from it, and Arya bought a needle with a good eye and a square of blue cloth she told herself was for wrapping bread but knew was for something else she could not name yet. They did not linger. On the way out, they passed a man on a mule with a bough slung over his back who looked careless, and Arya's neck crawled, and she turned to look again and saw that the man was not careless at all. He was that precise species of cruel that does not need to exert itself. Arthur saw, did not change his step, and kept his body between the man and Arya until they had passed onto the long road that melted at the edges in heat. "You know him," Arthur said after a while. "Yes. I do not ask." "Thank you." That night the wind was harder and made the fire uncertain. Arthur told her to sleep first. He sat with his back against a rock and listened to the wind and pretended it was rain. She slept and dreamed of a hall she had left and of stepping through a door she could not stop herself stepping through. When she woke, he was awake too, and a layer of fine dust had settled on his hair and beard. He looked like a statue that someone was carefully erasing. She wanted to say something useful and said instead, "We will need more salt." "We will find it," he said. And she loved him in that instant, or something like love that is the child of respect and complicity. Summer burned into autumn in the hills without announcement. Only a quieter kind of heat, fewer insects pretending to be leaves, a different set of stars insisting on their version of order. Arthur began to talk more and asked her to be quiet more, a reversal that felt like a right. He told her stories that were not stories, instructions disguised as remembering. Once he said, "There is a kind of killing that is neat and a kind that is unavoidably messy. If you are honest, you will admit that neither is clean. You will learn to hate the neat kind more because it lies." Another time he said, "I have a debt that seems to have no creditor. It is the kind that you can pay only by living in a certain way and hoping the ledger balances without any hand setting ink on the page." She did not ask him about a tower or about a prince or about a man in a green cloak or about a father's friend with a long face and a capacity for sorrow that was considered a virtue in a place where sorrow was plentiful. She did not need to ask. She understood that the debt he referred to could not be articulated without dishonoring its nature. Instead, she asked him, "What is the opposite of the sword of the morning?" He looked at her with something like humor. "A knight with no sword at all." "I don't believe that." "No, you don't." He smiled. "Then perhaps the opposite must be something like a snow that does not melt. The sword that does not shine but answers a different kind of light." "You are thinking of that." "Of something like that," she admitted. "I do not want to be anyone's morning. I do not want to be anyone's song. I want to be the fact of winter for those who would do harm. Not the storm, the breath before the storm, when the world holds itself and listens. He closed his eyes and breathed. Then we must teach you to hold the world. She found herself doing things she would have scoffed at months ago. She sat for long minutes watching a leaf at the end of a twig and tried to see it without pursuing its edges with her eyes. She stood in the stream at dusk and let the cold climb up her legs and visited each place the cold settled with her attention until it became part of the landscape rather than the threat. She practiced stepping with the ball of the foot first and then with the heel and listened to the different whispers. She ran the forms until she could do them with her mouth full of water without spilling a drop, and then with a stone in the shoe, and then with one eye covered, and then with both eyes closed while Arthur moved around her and breathed in certain ways so she could find him in the air. He began to teach her particular fights, as if they were dances. "A man with an axe," he said, and showed her the way an axe wants forward and fears the side, and the manner in which the man with the axe feels bigger than he is until he is on his back, and how you can put him there without breaking anything important. "A man with a spear, and the angles that are invisible until they are not, and the way to turn the spear into a long blunt staff he will be ashamed of. Two men who think their courage lies in each other, so they cannot be broken singly. The fight a woman might bring who looks slight and whose knife is a length of wire and whose hands know how to twist a wrist in 3 places without warning." He did not teach her to kill them in instruction. He taught her to own the space they required. The killing would happen if needed and knew how to happen without a tutor. Sometimes he put the white blade aside and took up a different one, a practiced sword with nicks like lines on a palm. With that blade he fought her. The first time, she brought up needle and the practiced blade pushed it away like a door being closed on a child. She had to stand very still and remind her heart that beating was an option. He did not take advantage. He stepped back and showed her how to use a smaller sword beside a longer one without asking the small to be the big or vice versa. "The small one is not a lesser version," he said. "It is itself. Treat it as a second voice that can sing a harmony that surprises." He made her move the 2 things at once, the small blade and her body, the long thought and the short cut. She came away bruised and smiling like a thief coming away richer from a place where she had expected to leave poor. Work entered her not merely as muscle but as a habit of mind, a taste. She woke already moving. She learned when to stop and when to stay stopped even if her nerves jittered like birds inside her. She slept and dreamed fewer dreams and woke with the salt of them in the corners of her mouth. She thought of Winterfell and did not allow it to break her. She thought of her father and let the thought break her and did not hide the brokenness from herself. She learned that strength is a word people use to name the part of endurance they admire, but that real endurance is made of stubbornness and clarity and a willingness to acknowledge that you are tired and might fail and to move anyway. The day came when Arthur brought her to a ridge above a fortress that looked as if wind had carved it while in love with the stone. The place was white and clean and old as a dream. The bend in the river below made a mirror that in late afternoon showed the sky to the world when the world had turned its face away. He said nothing, but she knew where they were, and the knowledge sat in her discreetly, like a single date in a bowl, sweet and with a pit that could break a tooth if you were not careful. "You need to look at it," he said. "Even if you do not enter, people imagine they can carry the weight of a place without ever lifting it. It watches the river as if waiting to see someone come back." He made a sound that meant yes and no. "It watches everything." They did not go down that day or the next. They slept on the ridge, and she watched him as he watched the place. And the place watched them, and something like an understanding formed between all 3 that they could share the air without injury. On the 3rd day, he brought her down along a path little used and showed her a wall where ivy had taught itself to make a ladder. He climbed first because he did not ask her to do what he would not do. At the top, he pulled her up and made a basket for her foot with his hands so she would not scrape the skin of her knees. She found her breath shallow. Inside, it was cleaner than she had expected of a place that was worn by so many hands. Nothing extra survived. The open spaces were not empty. They were spaces for thinking. He led her to a long room with windows that cut the sun into measured bars and a rack where old practiced swords lived like loyal dogs waiting for their masters to call them by names they had not been given but had earned. He took one down, placed it in her hands. She almost told him she already had one, as if he did not know. but she understood and said thank you. She could feel the years in the wood, which is not a fanciful saying. It had been held by men who spent their hours making themselves instruments, and the hands leave something behind in good wood that another hand can find if it is taught to look. She steadied herself and pressed her breath into her belly and descended to a place inside where the forms lived now when they were not in use. Then she moved. The blade hummed in a register not audible to those without that instrument built into them. She moved and the room changed. The room had seen too much to pretend to care, but the light noticed. At a certain step the light bowed and bowed again and shifted across the floor so that she could see herself as shadow and not be distracted by the shape. She finished, and the end of the last shape coincided exactly with the end of a long breath, and Arthur said, "Now again." And she did, and this time she felt the go. St of the man who had once moved there with a different blade and made a different kind of promise. He stood in that breath an instant, and then he left because he had better places to haunt. Afterward, Arthur brought her to a window where the river showed its back and the hills made their long tired gestures, and he spoke as if she had asked him for something. "I cannot give you this sword," he said. He did not point. There was only one sword to discuss here that would make such a sentence fit the air. It is not given. It is bestowed by a house you do not belong to. There is a justice in that. Apart from any stories men have told, there is still that justice. Furthermore, I am not the man who can bestow it any longer, even if I wish to defy justice. I set it aside and became only a man with a blade who was trying to make a decent day from the bad currency the past had handed him. "I am not asking," Arya said. The honesty of it surprised her with a small clean pain. "I would not take it if you offered it. I want something that is mine. If I must borrow a name, let it be for a while only, to protect what is growing until it can hold its own." "I thought you would say that, but we must speak near it and then walk away and then come back. That is how to speak of serious things. If I do not teach you how to step around the gravity of a legend, it will siege you and starve you out in a year." "I will not be starved out." There was a scrap of ferocity in her tone that lifted her chin without permission, and he smiled without malice. "No," he put a hand out and let it hover, not touching her, as if saluting the iron in her bones. "But I have seen better women than you lose themselves to something that did not deserve them. Be careful which stones you let into your pockets before you walk into the river. Then use the years you have to guard me from the ones you can name." "I intend to." They left the fortress as they had entered it, like a sound being sucked back into a drum. At the edge of the city of stone, he paused and looked back once, and something in his face softened, as if the place had said, "Go," in a voice only he could hear. That night their fire was small and their talk smaller. She did not tell him that she had dreamt of a sword like winter, not white, not black, but the color of a sky after the first honest snow, when all the lines are redrawn and life proceeds according to a stricter kindness. Work resumed and deepened. The forms paired her to essentials. The days made their own rules. Some days were made for pushing until the hands shook and the breath was ragged. Some days were made for stopping and walking in silence, learning the ways trees talk to rocks. On a flat where the wind had left its signature as a script in sand, he used a stick to draw circles and lines and asked her to enter and stand on a line where it met a circle and then to defend herself without stepping outside any of the lines. She found she could not and then could. He added another circle. She learned joy the way she learned new blades. Not because she had asked, but because she had made room in herself. She had thoughts she did not share. In some of them, she entered Winterfell in the morning when snow made the yard sing under the feet of young men attempting to be their fathers. In some, she entered at night, climbed the wall unseen, and walked to the gods would like a girl returned from a dare. In some, she did not enter at all but set up her camp just within the woods and watched across weeks as the life of the castle flowed, and she made her own oath without requiring their hearing. She did not decide which was truest yet. Part of work is allowing decisions to ripen. When the first thin frost visited the hills and the stream woke late and cranky, Arthur said, "I am going to take you to a man who will show you how to make the hands that hold your sword from a piece of metal you can wear. I could show you how to wield every blade from here to the bitter sea, and I could still not make you what you need if your hands cannot resist themselves. Gloves are not the point. The point is how you treat your hands. They walked 2 days to a forge whose chimney did not cough like most but exhaled with a steady discipline that felt like entering a church. The blacksmith was tall and quiet, and half her hair had gone white early, and she did not cow at Arthur, and he did not ask her to. She looked at Arya and then reached out without words and took Arya's hands and turned them, examined the calluses, scratched the dirt with her thumb, then blew on the skin. "You do not respect your fingers," she said, and Arya was insulted and then admitted the insult had struck true. "Let me show you how to keep what is given and how not to take what you will need 40 years from now." Many forget to save a future for themselves, and then at 40 they weep like children when the bottle will not open. The smith did not weave spells. She boiled tallow with something that smelled like pine and made a bomb and showed Arya where to place it and how much and when the hand wanted it and when the hand needed to be told no. She made Arya a pair of light gloves with a thin steel mesh sewn into the back so a cut would be a cut and not the end of a hand. She took a piece of iron and heated and hammered it while Arya watched, and the iron did not become beautiful, and the smith was satisfied with that truth. "Do not make all your tools pretty," she said. "Some will belong to ugly days and let them look like it. If the world insists you polish everything until it reflects you, the world is trying to make you vain. Vanity is how many good hands go sick." "I will pay," Arya said, and the woman shook her head once and tightened her mouth the way people do when they have accepted a pain and are telling it to sit down. "Your work pays," she said. "Pay me with your work. Go and learn what you are being taught." Then to Arthur without change in voice, "Do not keep her too long because she will think your kind of knowing is the only kind, and I will not forgive you for that theft." On the way back to the slot, they were silent again because the day had been honest with them, and they owed it the honor of not putting words over its face. That night Arthur held his hands out to the fire as if warming them for some small task and said, "Starfall did not give me the thing that made me dangerous. It named it. That was all. I understand." She was not flattering him with agreement. She had learned the difference between agreeing to speed a conversation and agreeing because one's blood agreed. "I am an old man now," he said. "My bones know the weather before the weather knows itself. My hands when I wake are the hands of someone else at first, and I must persuade them daily to be mine. When I walk by water, I am a little more polite with it. I have less time to waste fighting things I cannot learn." He looked at her and did not speak the remainder aloud, but she heard it anyway. "I do not know how many days I have to give you. Whatever I can give, I will, while the mornings obey me." It was the only time she allowed herself to think of him leaving before she did. She folded the thought away again and tucked it where her other dangerous treasures lived. The day that broke them open came without a warning on the calendar. They woke. They ate. The pony flicked flies and tried to look dignified while he did it. The forms went smoothly until they didn't. He stepped into her blade for the first time on purpose and let it kiss his sleeve, and her heart fell into her knees until she realized he had done it to show her that she was not, by nature, dangerous to those she cared for if she was careful. He smiled, showing her the neat hole she had made in the cloth, and she wanted to hug him and never do it again and to do it again all at once. He told her to make the hole larger with the practice blade, and she couldn't, and he looked exceedingly pleased. Later, when the sun was high and he liked to add a step none of them expected to see, men came. They did not make the courtesy of hiding their approach. They rode ordinary animals and wore leather that had been in too many fights and smelled like the fights had been losses even when they were wins. Their faces were a geography of hunger. The one in front had a scar that took and took again and had not learned to be content. They smiled at the camp as if the camp was a market stall and they had coins to spend they disliked keeping. "Water," said the one in front. Arthur nodded, as if he too were thirsty. "You are welcome to it." "We are welcome to anything we want," the second said, and let his eyes place their hands where hands were not yet permitted. The third spit onto the ground and frowned, looking at the spit as if it had offended him. Arya felt the old thing inside her stand up and stretch and bare its teeth. Work did not stop this thing from standing. It invited it in as an ally, introducing it to the forms. She looked at Arthur, and he did not look back at her because there are times when a look itself can betray what the body intends. Could be a lesson, she thought, and then understood the incorrigible fact that some lessons must be demonstrated by things that do not know they are teachers. "What do you want?" Arthur asked, and his voice had that particular low background hum in it that meant he had removed anything extraneous, including fear. The man in front let his gaze crawl over the pale scabbard. "That." He smiled without mirth. "And the girl?" Arthur did not smile. "No." The man on the left laughed. "All that talk at the fork about a man who killed like it was a prayer, and it is this dried apple who carries the white. Lucky day for us." He reached to his saddlebag, drew out a knife the way a man shows a dog a stick. The pony took 3 steps back, and Arya's hand went to his neck again to steady the animal more than herself. She watched. She saw where the second man carried his weight. She saw how the third one let his left leg trail when the horse moved, as if it had been broken once and never mended properly. She saw how the first one was not seeing anything but the pale scabbard. Arthur lifted his hand in a way that asked for quiet without humiliating anyone. "You will drink from the pool there," he said, and not for the first time he sounded like a father at a table where a boy refused to accept that bread would be shared fairly. "You will not touch the sword. You will leave the girl alone, and you will leave your knives in your bags. If you do that, there is no problem in this day." Something in the man in front disliked the steady he found in the matter-of-fact of those words. He spat again, a narrow stream that landed on stone and made a dark coin there. "You don't say there is no problem," he said. "We say that. That is how it works out here." He dismounted and stepped close enough that Arya could see the pale yellow film on the man's eyes where fever had once touched him and left a calling card. He reached for the scabbard and Arthur moved his hand, nothing elaborate, and the man did not find the scabbard where he had been looking for it. He frowned, as if the scabbard had broken the rules of their game. He reached again, and his fingers brushed the leather, and Arthur put 2 fingers on his wrist and did something that looked like nothing much, and the man was on his knees looking up at the white sword like a child who had been told his pet was not his but the king's, and his mouth made a different shape now. "I said no," Arthur said softly. The second man laughed again, because sometimes when a person does not understand fear he paints it with laughter so he can own it. "He says no like a book says no," he mocked. "Like a priest at a wedding when the wrong man arrives." He slid off his horse and moved his shoulders and laced his fingers together and he cracked them. He looked at Arya and his eyes made it obvious what his hands had done when he had cracked them. She felt heat rise and sit under her skin like a fever that makes you see clearly and too much at once. "You want to play, old man? We can play." The third man, who had said nothing, had eyes the color of wood. He did not dismount. He watched like a scout who has been sent to see how the world works. He looked at Arya once and looked away in a way that told her he had measured her and found the measure indeterminate. She acknowledged him, a small nod that offered neither insult nor invitation. The second man came forward like a bird that has not been taught hunger will not always be answered. Arya felt the part of her that had been taught ask and ask again step into place. She moved to her left in the exact way Arthur had taught her and felt the ground under her foot give and the small shift in her hip that would have made her stumble had she not known it would come. She took needle in hand and listened to it tell her what it wanted and did not allow it to speak over her. The man swung his arm because he had been taught the arm is the point when in truth the point is the feet. She placed a foot where his foot wanted to be next and watched his arm follow a nonsense. And then she put the flat of needle against his wrist with more kindness than he deserved, because kindness is efficient, and the knife fell without ceremony onto the stone. He looked at his empty hand like a student who has forgotten the answer to a question that yesterday he had been proud of. Arthur's man rose. He did not attempt to take the sword a second time. He did not look at Arya as if she were a meal. He looked at his actions as if they had belonged to someone else. He touched his arm and winced. The third man on the horse smiled a small, honest smile at no one, breathed out a breath he had been holding. "Drink," Arthur repeated. The man who had lost his knife looked at his companion. The companion's mouth shook, not with fear but with that disgust men feel when they discover that the world has made them ridiculous. He looked from Arthur to Arya and back. He was deciding whether to risk their lives in order to keep the story he preferred to tell when alone among men who admired the same. A story that would carry him to sleep by pouring poison into him. He moved his jaw right and left. He looked at the pale scabbard. He looked at the white blade he had not seen out in the open and wondered if he wished to see it now. He did not. The third man dismounted at last and walked to the water first. He knelt and put his face in the water like a man at vespers. He drank and did not hurry. Then he stood and wiped his mouth on the back of his hand and nodded to Arthur, not as a subordinate but as a peer who had survived many nights and recognized the other's survival. He took the reins of his horse and backed away and waited for the other two to do the same. It was a delicate moment, and Arya held her breath because this part, always, could break a day in half. The man with the fever eyes went last. He knelt. He drank. He rose. He did not look at her blade. He looked instead at the ground where the knife had fallen, and then, with a motion that surprised everyone but perhaps himself, he left the knife there and mounted his horse empty-handed and rode away without looking back. Arthur did not sheathe the sword until they were gone. He did not smile. He handed Arya a piece of dried meat and sat and ate as if nothing had happened, and perhaps that was true enough. She ate, and the tremble only came later, in her fingers as they cleaned the bowls, and he did one little thing then, a steadying palm against her back between the shoulder blades, and removed it the instant the tremble went away. That night the wind was teeth again and the sky was very black. Arya lay on her side and watched the fire go smaller and felt the good ache of muscles that had been used honestly all day and thought about the men and how they had almost made a different kind of day and how easily that happened. She turned her face to the ground and smelled the dust and the faintest oil from the blade on her hip, and she spoke aloud because you must speak vows aloud at least once, even if no one hears, because the air must carry the truth if it is to be a truth you obey. I will be a sword that answers to something that matters, she said. I will not be the kind that dances for coin. Arthur did not say anything then, but in the morning he made a different breakfast, one with honey, and when she asked what the occasion was, he said, You made a small vow and a large one last night, and both require sweetness today. How did you hear? She was shocked, then foolish to be shocked. I hear what matters, he said. We all do when we are quiet enough. Winter was pressing its cheek against the far side of the world when Arthur said, It is time for you to go north. He did not elaborate, as if the sentence had been spoken in him in the same way the word dawn appears, which is to say it does not appear, it simply is. Arya had been feeling a tide anyway. Birds had changed their talk. Her blood had changed its itinerary. She was ready and not ready exactly as one ought to be before a journey that will ask more than you have and then provide it as you walk. How? She asked. She allowed the word to carry all the other questions in train. Where, when, with whom, with what hidden name, with which blade? As yourself, Arthur said. Else the road will not teach you what it needs to teach you. He gazed toward the river as if it might answer. You may carry other names in your bag in case there is weather, but if you wear them lightly. Too many coats will make you clumsy. She nodded. Will you walk with me part of it? He shifted his weight, an old man's negotiation with the part of the day that had not yet begun. He smiled in apology at his bones. I will walk as far as the place where the road becomes the northern road, where it is unwise to be without the right kind of winter in your pockets. There I will stop. I have debts to consider. She wanted to ask whether he meant the kind of debt you pay by living well when you have lived badly, or the kind you pay by holding vigil for a past that does not know how to die. She did not ask. She put her hand on his arm in an unpracticed gesture. It is one thing to learn how to swing a blade and another to learn how to touch, and said, Thank you, and it covered everything well enough. His hand turned under hers and held it for a moment, and the hand felt like a promise, nothing more and nothing less. They took 3 days to become the movement of leaving. They cooked the last of the grain. They ate the last figs and laughed at how sticky their fingers became and did not wash them immediately, allowing themselves the tamed disorder. They took the rope down and coiled it properly and stored it where rain would not dare to reach. Arthur wrapped the pale scabbard with a strip of cloth and only then slung it over his back. Arya walked the slot and touched the stone with her fingertips as if committing it to the same place in her where she kept essential names. They led the pony out and paused and looked back without theatrics. The road north begins in heat like any other. It sheds it gradually the way a snake sheds the old skin that has brightened and tightened too long. They crossed low hills and the wind changed and learned to speak a language Arya remembered with her muscles. In the rain shadow of a ridge they met 3 children in rags who had a bird with a broken wing and expected cruelty. Arthur took the bird without words and did not heal it. He did something less immediately satisfying. He placed it where the ground had not yet frozen and made a little pen of stones that would keep the foxes at bay for a time, and then he bent the wing back and set it not quite right. The bird looked at him as if he were not a god and not an enemy but a fact. He looked at the children until one of them stopped spoiling the boyish face with a scowl borrowed from a cruel man, and then he handed the bird to the one who would not drop it, though his arms were tired. The boy swallowed a sob and did not make the gesture of thanks and ran away, because gratitude was a luxury not yet permitted. The other 2 watched and followed. They slept under an oak once, and the rain moved in sideways and tried to persuade them to admit they were miserable. Arthur sang under his breath then, nothing fancy, an old song about a woman waiting for her husband who could not come home because the river liked him too much and did not wish to give him back. Arya did not ask whether he had a wife. She imagined he had had 1,000 days that felt like marriage and 1,000 nights that felt like widowhood, and that neither added up to a story he could place before anyone with pride. In the morning he made a fire from wood that had no right to burn and made tea that tasted like bark, and she loved the tea and the way he insisted that it would be good before it became good. When roads diverged they took the one most like the line of a spine, upright, unswerving. As they walked they spoke in brief about everything that would matter when she could not turn to him and ask. "Do not eat snow if you can help it," he said. "It will freeze you from the inside out. Melt it. Let it become water again. Trust it as water." He showed her how to set a snare as if it were a kindness and how to skin what she caught without wasting the parts that must not be wasted. He showed her where to place her body when wind becomes knife. He showed her how to hear where not to camp. The days were a string of beads and each bead mattered. At the place he had named, he stopped. The valley opened, and beyond it the land lifted itself into the great shoulder of the world where she had been born, and she felt all the names she had ever learned once attempt to gather. She had been made again here and again and again, and the trees recognized her now and discounted the changes as growing pains a cousin might pass judgment on and then forgive. Arthur looked at it all and nodded as if he were closing a book he had read as a youth and had found again and wanted to praise for what it had not lied about. "Here," he said. She looked at him. "You could come farther." "I could." He did not try to make it easy with a lie. "But this line is clean. My work is here. Yours is there. Is this the last time?" She did not mean the last time they would see one another. She meant the last time a thing would be as simple as this. A teacher and a student recognizing the end of a lesson and the beginning of a different one. For a while. He held her eyes the way one holds a blade when handing it to someone else, with respect and clarity. "Take this." He reached into the pack he had carried and took out the square of blue cloth she had bought in the town months ago and gave it back to her. "I kept it because sometimes the thing you think you want to keep is too heavy to carry safely if it belongs to you. Now it will be safe because it belongs to you again." She laughed, a sound she had not made like this for a long time, a sound almost careless with joy. "You thief, only for you." He looked beyond her to the hills and to the place where her breath had changed the first time she had run from the kitchens and dared the yard. "Mind," he said, and the word had 7 meanings and all applied. "Remember the forms, then forget them when you must. Do not let your small blade die of jealousy when the big one sings. There is a kind of mercy you will have to deny yourself sometimes. Believe me, I know. When you can spare it, spare it. When you cannot, do not pretend. The pretended mercy becomes cruelty." "I will not be a pretender," she said. "No," he put his hand on her head, not quite tender, entirely human. It was a benediction as unsentimental as an iron pot and as necessary. "You have a place, not because the world offers it, Because you will make it by standing in it and refusing to be moved. She hugged him then. It was clumsy. It took him by surprise. It took her by surprise. He hugged her back with only his arms. Then he let go before the moment could become something it should not be. "Go," he said. She did not say goodbye. She turned, adjusted the pony's lead, settled the pack on her back, checked the blade at her hip and the other at her shoulder and the tucked knife at her boot, and began to walk. She did not look back immediately because looking back is sometimes disrespect. After 20 steps she looked, and he stood as he always had, like a person at ease in his body on whichever day of it he had been given, not asking for qualifications. He raised a hand. She raised a hand. The wind between them was an old friend and carried nothing. She took the northern road into its hardness. Days compressed into gray. The sky was a low ceiling. Her breath smoked and her hands obeyed the smith. She did not hurry, because work had taught her that hurrying makes worse days, and she did not dawdle, because the cold punishes the sentimental. Villages came and went. People did what people do when a stranger walks in, measured with eyes and with the way their mouths refuse and then offer small things. She slept in barns and beneath sleds and once in a church that had forgotten its gods. She spoke to no one of any import, because import would notice her, and she was not yet ready for notice. When snow came, it came like an old law being reenacted. The quiet of it was a different quiet than desert quiet. Desert quiet is a testing. Snow quiet is a gift. She moved as she had been taught to move, knees alive, hips a hinge, breath tucked where it must be. She spoke into her scarf and heard herself again without the distance the wind makes. The pony learned to be a northern animal and remembered things buried in its bones from horses longer dead. She sang under her breath sometimes, a song she did not know she knew, about a girl who climbs a wall in the morning and finds her face in the ice. On a small road that pretended it was not a road, she came upon a trader with a cart and a boy who could not be called his son but had learned to follow. The cart had lost a wheel to a low deceit, a stump hidden by snow. The man swore and did not dismount and kicked the wheel with the heel of his boot as if the wheel needed to be taught who was master. The boy watched Arya approach and was deciding whether to beg for mercy or pretend he did not need it. She dismounted and did not make a choice for the man. She went to the wheel and surveyed the injury and then looked at the wood of the cart and then at the axle. "Lift," she said to the boy, who blinked at being addressed as if human and then made himself ready. The man did not move, not out of suspicion but because habit is a chain. She set a lever of birch and asked the boy to push on the word and push again, and the lever obeyed the math and the wheel lifted and she slid the axle clear and unpacked a piece of rawhide from her bag that could be knotted when wet and tighten as it dried. She worked as Arthur had taught her to work. The man got down then because work has its own gravity, and he held steady what she asked him to hold stead, and the boy breathed as if dogs had just run past and not stopped. The wheel returned to the axle and the knot held. She stood, wiped her hands on the snow, looked at the boy, who had grown a head taller in the hour. The man tried to pay her with a pouch that had coins in it and she shook her head. "You'll need that," she said. "You'll need it, surely, on the road. I have other payment." She touched the bag where she kept the blue cloth and her bomb and 3 letters from a world no post could reach. "You will do a small kindness without calculation before night," she told him. "That will be more useful than coin." The boy nodded as if she had given him instructions for a game he wanted to play. The man did not argue. He had once been a better man and had only been resting from it for a while. He would remember now. She mounted and moved on. The wheel turned behind her as if following a law of motion that comforted it. When she crested the last of the hills that tucked the north into itself, she could taste iron in the air and the thin cedar smoke of home. Her throat tightened in a way she had not experienced even when she had been a child. A full moon rose early from behind night, the face of a stranger who resembles a relative. She kept her pace measured. The ground began to speak to her in the accent she had always known. Her body set itself into a philosophy. She was ready to be seen, but not by those who would insist on an old version of her. Winterfell appeared not initially as towers and wall but as heat in the air, the way a large animal warms a glade without moving. Then the line of the battlements gathered itself from the white and gray, and the gods would showed the top of its dark. Her heart attempted to leave the work behind and run ahead. She held it by the scruff and told it to behave. She did not go to the gate. She went to a place a child would know, a low portion of the wall where it had been said the mortar was never properly set. The mortar had been set properly since, but a child's memory has a skill for other doors. She found a path she had measured with her body as small as she had been and laughed once at the audacity of it. She took the pony around to a stand of trees where his breath would not disclose him and found that his forlorn expression pierced her. She scratched his neck and promised him oats that had not yet been purchased and believed herself more firmly for the making of a promise that was so small and so honest. She pulled her hood low and tucked the cloth at her throat and then did the thing she had dreamed and refused to dream in turn for years. She put her hands to the stone and climbed. The first stones remembered her and the next ones were surprised and the last were resigned that all walls must be eventually climbed by those whom they pretend to reject. Her hands did what the smith had taught them and she found she could trust them to hold. Her breath went in with the cold and came out with heat attached. She reached the parapet and swung her leg over and knelt with her belly on the broad back of the wall and lay there for a long minute listening to her heart. She did not cry. She did not cry. She allowed the body to do what the body wished so long as it did not get them both killed. The yard was emptier than a summer yard would be, but no northern yard is empty even in winter. Men with shoulders like the vans of small ships moved upon tasks. A woman with a basket collected rags and gossip. A boy with reddened ears trotted through the gate with a note from someone that his feet were very proud of carrying. A dog saw her and did not bark, because the dog saw that she belonged. She waited until the rung of boots drifted elsewhere, and then she moved along the parapet with the knowledge of her childhood and the knowledge Arthur had given her, which together made her invisible to those who would have seen another. She made for the second way, the one that was not built as a way. The door into the godswood is not a door, not at this angle. It is a tuck behind a hall where men sleep who have earned their sleep. She slipped through it and the wood took her into itself, and at once she recognized what she had missed and had not admitted. The air held a smell you cannot speak accurately, even if you are honest. A red clean, a secret winter, a truth you can eat if you have the right teeth. The snow was a skin over the ground and the ground's breath rose in thin threads. The heart tree turned its old face toward her and did not alter its expression. She walked to it and knelt, a kneeling that had been in her bones before she knew why human knees move. She placed Needle on the snow in front of her with the respect her father had taught her for tools and for names. The weirwood watched. There are no words for the way a tree watches, the ways that are not eyes at all and yet see. She put her hand on the roots and told herself she would not say anything and then spoke because silence now would have been arrogance. "I have returned," she said, "and I have brought a sword. Not this one." She rested other fingers on the other blade at her back, the long, narrow winterlighter that Arthur had insisted she would make inside herself and had. "I have brought a sword that is not a thing you can hold. It is something I will keep honed with days. I do not know the shape of the years yet. There will be work. There will be moments I will desire the kind of mercy that lies, and I will hate you then if you tell me to refuse it, and later I will thank you without saying it. I will stand where I am meant to stand." The wind traced a path through the godswood and arranged the hair at her temple. She thought of the word he had said, mind, and all its meanings. She held herself as she had practiced, the shape that matched the breath. She felt the tree not speak and accepted being answered. She took up Needle and stood. She placed her hand on the trunk for a last second, because it seemed required, because she had seen her father do so, and because sometimes we must allow ourselves the luxury of such theaters if they uphold what is real. The first person to see her was not the first person she had wished would see her. It was a kennel keeper with hands that smelled of straw and wet dog and a kindness that had been justly acquired. He was coming through the wood because a stray had been seen near the pond. He stopped when he saw her and put his hand on his chest as if his heart had startled, and then nodded once as if he had seen her yesterday and she had failed to return 2 bowls after borrowing them, an offense he had always intended to forget. "My lady," he said out of habit. and she let the words touch her without attaching themselves. He seemed an honest man who did not insist on what he had said being the truth, merely the right sentence for the moment. She liked him for that. "Please don't," she said and smiled a little. "There's no need." "Then there is none." He smiled back because he wanted to show her how a man agrees without losing face. He might teach other men this, and that would be one kindness fulfilled. "If you seek someone," he added, "you will find her at work. Always." Arya nodded. She knew it would be so. Work is a faith like any other. "Thank you." He went on along his errand with the same pace as before, which was the gift he could give best, and she left the Godswood by a different path than she had come, which was a courtesy to old rules. She kept to places where you could see the drops in the snow where someone had walked before, and where no one had because not all things follow tracks. She made her way to the long hall because even if you seek a single person, you begin where work begins. Inside, Winterfell was the congruence of stone and heat and breath she had known as a child and had believed unique to itself and then discovered, after much wandering, was indeed unique. It had a sound, a voice of its own, a murmur of men who had known each other since the world began for them and would bury each other when the world ended and a new one began for someone else. She set her shoulder against a post before anyone saw her and watched their lives unfold in a little frame. A boy issued orders with the air of one who has borrowed adult words and is renting them for a while. A woman with a measure of flour directly measured a quarrel between two men with a look. A dwarf, no, not one she knew, set down a mug before he laughed, as if he knew the slosh would be a waste. She watched until her eyes had eaten enough to satisfy the hunger of the long travels without becoming gluttonous. Then she stepped forward and let herself be noticed by the right person. It was not a drumbeat. It was sutured into the day. A hand touched an elbow. A mouth shaped a name without volume. Another mouth shaped the same without pushing the air. The room did not stop. It changed, in the way a room does when someone who belongs has returned with a part of the winter outside carried in her and a part of the summer inside saved for this moment. She made herself small not out of shame but because small is sometimes stronger than large. She moved in a path that led through a slow parade of recognition to the place where she knew she would find her sister. Sansa stood with a ledger and a face that had learned to not show a fraction of what it saw. She had the hands of someone who can be cruel when the arithmetic forces it, and a mouth that had learned how to be kind in ways that cost her very much. Her hair was simple. She did not wear jewels. To wear jewels here would be to teach the men what to hate in a woman. She looked up and saw Arya and did not let the ledger drop. She closed it, and that was the sound of a door in a house where you feel safe closing doors. "Arya," she said. "Sansa." They did not move at first. It was not fear. It was the knowledge that this moment would decide many of the next, and that work sometimes involves standing still in a feeling until it finishes with you. At last, Sansa placed the ledger on the table. She came around it and put her hands on Arya's shoulders. Arya felt tall and small and precise and messy and all the contradictions that the truth invites, and then Sansa was holding her, and Arya was surrounded by the unmistakable smell of her, the small powder, the wool, the winter air she carried, and they were not girls and they were not the women they would eventually be. They were two sisters who had done their separate and cruel schooling and were now placing their papers side by side. When they drew back, neither cried. There would be time for that as well as the other business. Sansa looked at the sword on Arya's back and at the smaller one at her hip and at the third, worn at the boot like a secret, and nodded the way a steward nods at a list he will not question. "You've come to stay, then?" she asked. The question could be answered in 6 ways and all would be true and none adequate. "I've come to stand," Arya said. Sansa's mouth softened. "Good," she said. "The standing is what we need most." She turned and took up the ledger, and she handed it to a young girl who had been watching them with the expression of someone who has been starving for a particular kind of story. "Here," she told the girl. "Keep it. Write the truth. Not all of it, but enough." When they were alone enough that a sentence could be spoken without 20 ears making 20 stories with it, Sansa took Arya's hand in the casual way of those who grew up before the work of touching was made complicated by years. "You've a name," she said. "I have more than one." Arya said, not ashamed. Yes. Sansa smiled a crooked smile their mother had worn when she knew which thing to hide and which to show. But which will you give them? The one we need. Arya looked up at the rafters where smoke insisted on living. I am a sword here if you will have me, not a lady, not a hunter in shadow. A sword that answers when the house calls by its true name. I have walked too long with blades to pretend otherwise. I will be the sword of this place, Sansa. Not the morning, Winterfell's own. I will stand where our father would want someone to stand. I will not be bought with songs. I will break where necessary, but I will not bend wrong. Sansa looked at her for a time that was a heartbeat and a lifetime. Then you are what we prayed without knowing how to name it, she said quietly. We will make you room. She glanced behind Arya, through the hall's door and down the line of the corridor that led toward the outer yard, toward the armory, toward the life that smelled like oil and leather and iron. There are those who will not know how to love you for what you are, only for what you might have been had you come home before the world taught you itself so hard. I know, Arya said. Do not allow their ignorance to hire you as a grief. Sansa smiled with one side of her face. Tell me everything, but not now. Now tell me only, are you hungry? It was a joke and not a joke. It was a line that tied them to a past in which all questions were answered with soup and a hand on hair. Yes, Arya said. Very. Sansa laughed. Good. That I can fix. They ate from bowls held in hands that remembered how to hold such bowls. Arya listened to the hall do its breathing, watched the fire commit slow thefts from the logs, assessed the small flaws in the blade of the man at the bar who would present as a problem when he drank too fast, and filed away the way he moved so she would know where to step when that time came. Sansa talked not of politics, which Arya suspected would come like a tide regardless of desire, but of small changes that mean more. A new cow that gave milk as if it took pride in it. A boy who had learned his letters and now wrote notes to the girl he loved as if there were a war in every sentence. Old Maester's cough and how it was worse at night, but he refused to keep the warmer blanket because he felt guilty to love warmth in winter. Arya listened and added these to the list of reasons. Later, when sleep was near, she asked for a pallet near the door and not a bed upstairs. Sansa made a mouth as if to argue and then said nothing, because she had learned that telling a sword where to sleep is as foolish as telling winter where to blow. Arya lay with her cloak around her and knew the hall had watched her lay down, and accepted the fact of her. She woke a few hours later and went to the yard and drew the blade and ran the forms, quiet as mercy. On the last shape she looked up and saw the snow begin to fall and felt the weight of her work settle properly on her shoulders, neither lighter nor heavier than it should be. In the days that followed, she became what she had promised. Not ceremonially, not by proclamation, but by standing where standing needed to be done and moving where movement must. She prevented a fight between two men who loved each other like brothers, and whose fathers had hated each other like rivals by stepping between them and telling a story neither wanted to hear about a man she had seen die for a cause that had paid him with emptiness. She watched the armorer teach a boy to hold a hammer and showed him how to kiss his knuckles after he missed, not with indulgence but with recognition. She walked the wall at dawn and at last light and felt the stone speak to her through her boots. She entered the God's wood again and left no offerings but her breath. Word does what it does. It moved out appropriately, neither in whispers nor with trumpets. People began to say the line that made its way into the world as if the world had asked for it without knowing the form. The Sword of Winterfell. It did not begin as a title but as a description of a necessity. Then it became a thing men said about her when they thought of danger and were afraid and wished for a story. She heard it and did not deny it. She sharpened it by doing what had to be done. When a man came in the night with a petition that could have been a trap, she examined it the way one examines a wound to see if it needs a stitch or the amputation of a finger. When a woman came in day with a complaint that had a truth at its center and 1,000 small lies gathered about it like flies, Arya burned the lies with a look and salvaged the truth and placed it gently where it belonged. She did not forget the lessons from Shadow. She stepped softly when soft was the correct step. She learned which doors creaked and which told their own secrets. She learned the names of the dogs and the names of the men who needed to be told to go home early so they would not beat the dogs when drunk. She learned to be bored and to do that with seriousness, because some days the work of a sword is simply to be present and heavy and keen and not to cut. At night she sometimes sat at the parapet and watched the stars, and in the wind she could hear, if she allowed herself, the conversation of sands 1,000 miles away, and the gulls argumentative still, and the sound a blade makes when drawn without blood. And she felt, not with her ears but with the place inside where work lives, the presence of the man by a stream touching his blade and refusing to be made into either saint or story, and she let herself grieve and be grateful for him in equal measure. She did not write letters. There are letters you cannot write if they are to remain true. But she sent her days across the distance with their corners trimmed neatly and their weight appropriate, and believed they would arrive where they must. Winter settled with the gravity of a well-loved book placed decisively on a table. Her breath showed her to herself. Men who liked to say the words duty and honor learned to say the word patience and found they liked its taste. Women who had never liked to be called by any word other than their names found their names carried differently on the air now that it was thinner and honest. Arya stood and did the work and found she had not lied to the weirwood. She had brought a sword to this place. It was not one you could display above a mantel or speak of in a hall with a full belly. It was a shape in the air when she stepped and a flash in the decision when she did not. It cut what should be cut and spared what should be spared and argued with her when she was tempted toward the easy cruelty. On an evening that began with distant bells and ended with tired relief, she walked back into the yard, and the dog that had never loved anyone but the kennel boy came to her and placed its head against her leg shamelessly. She put her hand on its skull and felt it breathe in as if trying to pull her smell further into itself. She laughed, bent, scratched the place behind its ear that all dogs pretend no one knows, and the dog groaned with the pleasure of surrender. The snow fell in small deliberate flakes that would not be hurried into their history. She lifted her face into it and closed her eyes and saw the white blade only once in the darkness and let it go away without envy. Later, after meat and bread and the sound of men telling stories that were close enough to the truth to satisfy the night, she went to the godswood to speak to nothing again. She did not kneel this time. She stood as the house's sword must stand. "I will not be mourning," she said. "I will be you, the thing that does not pretend and does not abide foolishness and yet can hold a small bright bird in a hand and be gentle without shame." The tree did not answer. The wind did. It braided the hair at her temple again. She smiled, tiny, lioness small. "Yes," she said, as if someone had made a point she agreed with. Then she turned back to the hall, to the ledger that would need her to put a finger on a line and decide, to the boy whose letter to the girl was becoming a poem without his knowing it, to the man at the bar who was on the verge of his mischief. This was work. It would be work tomorrow. There would be danger and the necessity of a blade and the necessity of a closed fist and a gentle hand. There would be the old debts and the ones newly incurred. There would be the calculus of mercy's cost. There would be laughter too, because work without laughter becomes religion of the worst kind. There would be the day when letters arrived or did not arrive. There would be the day when the pony died, and she would mourn him harder than was polite. There would be a day when she would have to walk further than she thought she could, and she would. There would be a voice one night in the wind that would remind her of a man under a tree by a stream, who had said a name and laid down a sword and let a girl find a different one. There would be days when she hated this house and ordered herself to love it. There would be days when she loved it without being asked. She would stand. The sword of Winterfell would stand. And when morning came, as it would whether or not she asked it to, she would meet it without flinching. And when night came, as it must, she would stand with it too. The first true cold was not an event so much as a position, the world rearranging itself by degrees until frost became an attitude everything wore. Windows took on a skin of fern that did not crack with the first touch. Men in the yard drew their cloaks tighter not because they were weak but because the air insisted. The stone of Winterfell altered, not visibly, but in that way stone has of changing its sound, a deeper, older note when boot meets step and step meets weight. Arya took the measure of that note with the pads of her feet. She rose before the birds thought it useful and ran the forms in a square of yard where the snow had not yet decided to collect. The sky was a gray lid and the breath of the castle rose in a slow, considerate steam, venting from kitchens, from smithy, from the underbelly where hot springs taught the winter new manners. She moved until the ache in the shoulders turned into knowledge, until the muscles agreed to be instruments rather than arguments. The rope and knot exercise she had learned in the slot she had remade here with a line hung from a lintel. The knot hissed past her ear as she stood where it wished to stand and did not allow it. She kept her mouth shut about the nature of work when a boy with straw-colored hair and a bruise the size of a walnut at his jaw came early and stood with his hands shoved into sleeves as if hiding them made him invisible. "You can watch," she said without breaking the rhythm. "Or you can hold the rope." He stepped forward with the cautious eagerness that is truth in children. "Hold," he said, "because sometimes a word helps a body be brave." He took the rope. She could see how his thumb wanted to curl wrong. She would fix that. He swung the knot in the arc she had shown him yesterday and looked at her with one eye closed against the prospect of her blood. She stepped where not to be. He smiled, a real smile, his mouth becoming suddenly a child's again. "I didn't hit you. You tried to," she said, and he laughed with the unworried honesty that teaches all of us how to breathe for a second. By the hour when the cook's first porridge had thickened and begun to stick at the sides of the pots, Winterfell had discovered that its new sword also taught children. Not with bonhomie, not with indulgence. She took them as they were. She noticed the boy with a quick laugh and a shoulder that had been pulled and did not complain. She noticed the girl who had learned that watching men is safer than speaking to them, and taught her to speak with her hands. She noticed the way the littlest had been taught to swing as if a blow were evidence of existence, and she taught him that the better proof was not being where the blow fell. She did not make a school of it. She made a practice of it. She taught them to count to 10 not with numbers but with steps, so that when they were needed later the numbers would be in their feet and not merely their mouths. After, when they had scattered to their chores, she went to the smith with her gloves because the bomb had grown stiff. The smith here was a man called Hal with hair like iron filings and a demeanor that suggested he loved his work more than he loved any person and was therefore capable of loving any person properly. He took the gloves from her without making a ceremony and warmed the bomb with a tiny spirit lamp that he insisted on calling a candle. "Not too much," he said, as if she were a child, and she did not take offense because knowledge sometimes requires that tone. He watched her rub it in, nodded at how she coaxed the leather back into being an animal rather than a dead thing. "Good. Your fingers'll still be yours when you're old," he predicted, and she allowed the praise like a medicine on her tongue, useful but not to be made into a sugar. By then the hall had woken. Sansa's voice drifted through its usual conduits. Not loud, not stiff, a calm opinion that made the quarrel die before it grew legs. Arya took a bowl from a girl whose wrists were so thin she looked like a newborn foal and sat on a bench near the door because she preferred doors. The porridge had blackberries in it that had kissed frost and decided not to be destroyed by it. She ate and listened to the day forming around her. "She took the knife out of Hobbs' hand with a spoon," someone said. "It weren't like that," someone answered, more loyal to truth than to admiration. "She made him drop it with a word. I've never seen a word do that to a knife before. Words are blades," a woman said, and her mouth closed as if she had not meant to let that particular truth escape. After the porridge, a man came. He had a cap too fine for his coat. The coat had been mended by someone who cared but was poor at it. The cap did not account for the coat. He stood just inside the door and tried to look like a person with business among his own people and not someone who had borrowed business. Arya watched him hesitate and then go for the easiest prey. A boy with a ledger too large for him. The boy looked watery and Arya's hands itched at the idea of someone ringing him. "You'll want me," she said, stepping into the man's notice before he could make a mistake they would both have to pay for. He looked relieved in the way men do when they age. Ave found the person they can talk to without being found out by the lie they asked someone else to carry for them. "Lady Stark," he began, and stopped because he recognized she wasn't that. He tried again. "Sword," he said, and that was honest enough. "I've come from White Harbor with salt fish and a matter that prefers the quiet ear." "Then use the quiet mouth," she said, and he nodded as if she had instructed him in a thing he had always wanted to learn. She gestured to the scraps of paper at the table, patted one smooth, dipped a quill. She did not intend to write for him. She intended to watch how he changed when he saw it was possible to record his words in a way he could not retract. He said his name as if he had recently cleaned it. Meryn. He spoke of someone who spoke for Lady Manderley and ate too slowly for a man who was not supposed to love the fish he traded, which is how Arya knew the man wished to be honest in a dishonest job. He told her there were rumors of men at sea who took men from shore, not ships. Men who were paid in a coin with no king's face and no maker's stamp. A blank that bought as if the whole world were its mint. Blank money buys blank men, he said, and the phrase startled him because of its neatness. She weighed the news and the man and how his eyes darted not with guilt but with the unsureness of those who have to report without being believed. You brought salt fish, she said. We need it. He had set the baskets just inside the door like gifts a poor uncle brings and hopes will matter. A fair tally, he said, looking at the ledger boy with a respect that made the boy straighten. And I brought a knife I would like someone to sharpen who will not curse me for being clumsy with it. He produced the knife as a dog produces a stolen shoe when ready to be forgiven. It was a working blade, honest steel, edge-tired. Hal will take it, Arya said. Tell him you want it sharp without being unkind. He'll understand. As for the men and the coin, I'll speak of it. She would not fuss it into alarm. Alarm makes fools of wise men. She would give Sansa the shape of it and they would put their heads together like children under a blanket hiding a candle. When Meryn left, the lady with the ledger, no longer a girl in Arya's eyes now that the man had addressed her with respect, looked at Arya as if astonished that words could be arranged in a manner to change the posture of men you did not love. Arya smiled at her and handed her a scrap with a figure on it. We'll need to extend rations 3 days if the snow holds. Tell cook to stretch without lying. No water in the milk. The girl swallowed. Yes. The day found its middle and did what middles do. Asked for endurance, not brilliance. Arya checked the hinges on the west gate because they sang a complaint at a particular time of day, and she had learned to trust that the things you ignore when they sing will be the things that betray you when you sleep. She ran a hand along the iron and came away with the taste of it on her fingers. The man who oiled the hinges was also the man who wrote the handbills for feast days and felt poetry about oil. She told him to use a different mix and he tried to tell her he had always used this, and she asked if he wanted to always be wrong. He laughed, his pride punctured safely, and did as asked, and the hinges sang a different song that did not require attention. In the afternoon, a shield argument brewed by the training yard. 2 men who liked each other too much to see the other's faults were teaching a third and ended by teaching him their quarrel instead. The third man stood with a shield on his arm and his eyes full of obligation. Arya stepped in without stepping between because sometimes a step between is worse than a blow. Show me, she said. No prefis. No scolding. It would become a story later. They would say she had walked into their quarrel and made it dance like a cat with a string. They took their stance and told her the 2 theories of how to turn a blow on a round shield. She listened as if each were a lover making a promise, then took the round and asked for the blow. She let it land, turned it, felt the bite, saw the weakness. She gave it back to the third. It's less like a door and more like a millstone, she said to the man who liked to talk about doors. And more like a door than a drum, she said to the other, and both were right enough that both men felt honored. The third felt the thing in his hand become a different thing entirely. The quarrel evaporated because work had been found in it. As dusk laid its long hand over the hill, she went to the gods' wood because you must, or the place grows lonesome and you begin to make decisions like a person who has never seen a tree survive winter. The weirwood had a rim of ice on the edge of its leaves. The red did not apologize for the white. She stood with her coat open and let the cold measure her. She did not pray. She spoke to herself where the tree could hear. Men at sea, she said to the old face. Blank coins. The lips of the carved mouth did not move, and why should they? She did not want to be comforted. She wanted the line from problem to action to be straight. The tree approved of straight lines when they were drawn in truth. The next day brought a more ordinary crisis. A poacher, his hands chapped into scales, had taken a doe heavy with winter, a thing that was as much a theft from spring as from the larder. He had been caught not by a man but by a dog too fond of rules. They brought him to Arya because Sansa was counting sacks of grain with the exactness of a person who knows each sack contains 1,000 small lives. The man's face was the gauntness of a certain kind of hunger, the hunger that does not lean but gnaws. She did not make him kneel. She put a stool under him because she liked her interlocutors to have blood in their brains. "Tell me," she said, and he did, haltingly, as poor men do who are not accustomed to arranging their needs for the powerful. He had a wife with a cough and a boy with a rash and a dog that had forgotten how to hunt. He had meant to take a younger one and had failed. The dog had faltered in its old duty and he had failed it by asking old work of it. He wanted to be punished to be told there was order, but he also wanted not to be punished because he had learned late to be fond of breathing. "Who taught you to set a snare?" she asked. "My father," he said, as if admitting to a crime and a bit of pride at once. "Who taught you to fail to see the age of a doe?" "No one," he said, properly ashamed. "I knew better. I didn't want to know." "Good." She was glad to hear the truth. "You'll mend that. We don't kill spring. We guard it until it can guard itself." She looked at the guards, who were good men and too eager to feel they had done something. 3 days, she said, without meat, in the kitchens, under the eye of someone who will not let him steal, and who will teach him what he must learn about seeing the details of a body. After that, he goes with the hunt and makes himself useful. If he fails or lies, I'll know. If he does well, we will say so. If he mends the dog, he may return to taking rabbits where he is permitted. He will teach a boy what he learned. A boy not his own. The man gaped as if she had offered him a crown. Then a different thing happened. He believed her. His shoulders changed. "Yes," he said, not to please her, but because the sentence had built a small bridge in his mind and he wanted to cross it. He went away carrying something invisible and heavy that was not a sack of grain and was not his sin. "You grow soft," one of the guards muttered to another later, thinking she could not hear. That should have been a hand. She was near enough to answer. "We need hands," she said without heat. "There are wolves that need fewer. They are not us." The guard flushed because he had not hunted in years and had thought of himself as a wolf. He lowered his gaze, not out of shame but respect for accuracy. A raven came with ink on its feet and nothing legible in its beak. No letter, just a scrap of twine that had been wound about the leg like a ring and then cut. Neat. It would have meant nothing to a person who had never learned to read rope. Arya stood under the rookery eaves while the maester fussed and blinked his eyes, always red where they met the world. She took the raven gently and turned the leg. The twine had been tied in the pattern Arthur had drawn on the river sand one day when she had been impatient and he had been relentless. Circles and lines. 2 circles, 1 line through both and then bent. She closed her eyes and saw his hand. She smelled cold water and goat cheese. She felt the idea of him, which had become more useful to her than the man himself when she needed his advice. The knot told her what it always told her. Stand in the line and learn to bend. It was nothing and everything. It was him sending only what would not endanger either of them if seized by someone who loved to read also. She returned the twine to the maester as if it were nothing and put her hand on the raven's breast. Felt the tick of the fast heart. "Good bird," she said, to the maester. "Tell me if any other nonsense arrives." "Always," he promised, relieved to have a task that implied he was trusted. Snow fell for 5 days without prefacing or apologizing. It did not drift into art. It simply did its job. The yard became a whiteness interrupted by habits. Men moving along paths that grew into trenches that grew into corridors of winter. The dogs learned to surface in the right places. Children made walls as if they were making castles because the shape of it had become inherited. Arya ran her forms in a space on the wall where the wind hit so hard it cleared snow in a scouring. She learned to listen to her breath when the wind tried to teach her it belonged to the wind. She ate more. She slept in shorter pieces and more of them. Sansa learned to smile with her eyes only because the lower face belonged to the season's serious work. On the 3rd day, a horse appeared at the outer edge of the world like a brown punctuation mark that refused to resolve into a sentence until it fell. The rider slid from the saddle with a care you do not waste on your own body when you have news more valuable than your ribs. Arya went out because she had been turning to go out already. Often it works like that. The gates opened their old mouths and took her and the rider in. The man had a beard stiff with ice. He was not young and not old and had learned how to keep certain things alive by not telling anyone about them. He had a scar low across his belly she could see in the way he kept one hand at it. He was no one to her and therefore could be anyone. "Water," he said, and they poured it into him. "Bread." He chewed as if he must remind his teeth. He looked at her because she had become the face such men look toward when they decide whether to live another hour. He fumbled in his coat and took out something wrapped in waxcloth, small, a stick. The kind of carving a man does by a stream when he needs his hands to talk so his head will be quiet. He held it as if it held him back from falling through the floor. "I was told," he said, "to put this in the hands of the person who knows what to do with it." She took it. She turned it. The wood was pale and smooth and not precious. A notch at each end. A small star scratched by a nail. The weight meant nothing. The act meant everything. "Where?" she asked. The man's mouth dried. "South," he said. The word was a place and a direction and a confession. "Not far as the sea. In a place with water that does not always show itself." He said you would know. She did. She saw again the slot, the moss teeth, the rope tied to a branch with a knot you could not cut with fingers in cold. She saw the carved stick he had stuck in the stream bed and watched water push at it like a question. Her hand remembered the weight. She felt the shape of Arthur's absence as presence, which is how certain absences behave when those who make them have learned something right about leaving. She breathed once and placed the stick between her hands as if taking an oath. "Eat," she said, "then sleep, then talk if you must, or don't." He slept in the corner by the door where she preferred to sleep. She gave it to him without annoyance because the door was a door anywhere. She stood and watched the snow, watched the low sky move in its slow committees, looked once across at Sansa, who was counting up heads and hands and blankets in a small abacus of fate. Sansa caught the look and nodded. Later they would sit together and set this into their calculus. For now, they would let one exhausted man teach them nothing but how to take care of one exhausted man. The next morning she put the carved stick in a little wooden bowl she had as a child used to carry berries until her fingers had been dyed by them. It sat on the table between herself and Sansa, and the steam from both their cups rose and drew two crooked lines above it that braided and then parted. "He is alive," Sansa said, not making it a question. "He is," Arya said. She did not elaborate. Living can be worse than dead if done dishonestly. With him, living was work he did without complaint. She was content with that. "Will he come north?" Sansa's voice had none of the neediness of a younger sister. It had the respect for a story that may or may not wish to enter your house. "No," Arya touched the stick lightly with a forefinger. "I don't think so. He has found the shape of his days. He sends me the line of that shape when he thinks I might forget it." "For what?" Sansa asked. "For nothing," Arya said. "For everything." She smiled, and Sansa did too, because incomprehensible answers between sisters sometimes carry more truth than precise ones. After the stick, there was the man at the bar whose mischief she had predicted and whose mischief did not disappoint. He did what men do when the world is too big and they wish to be big in a smaller world. He turned it sideways and tried to sink a knife into it to hold it still. He laughed at a woman. Not because he despised her, but because he despised himself and wanted to be forgiven by someone he had made less. Arya was beside him before he managed to make it a knife. She did not need to draw. She placed her hand on his wrist and did nothing more than let him feel how much stronger his arm would have to be to do what he thought. He froze, not himself surprised, but like a dog the instant before it learns a trick it enjoys. She leaned so her mouth was near his ear, and she said the line she used sparingly, the line that stopped certain kinds of mischief from turning into certain kinds of grief. "I am not here for you," she said. "I am here for the people you would hurt when you are bored. Find a better boredom." He laughed then, great and loud and real, and put the knife back as if it were a child he loved but who could not be allowed to play just now. He bought a woman a drink without meaning anything ugly by it. He went home early because she told him to. He showed up late the next day with a bucket of coals for the Amy's kettle because he wished to say he was sorry without believing that the word itself made a dent in the world. Sometimes it is enough. A weather forfeit happened. The sky cleared and the cold stabbed down so fine it was like a wire pulled tight. The stars presented themselves not as familiar friends but as officials with papers, and Arya could see that another winter had been written somewhere without her input and was now being enforced. She walked the wall at a pace that let her talk to each stone. The men up there were not the ones who wanted to talk about fathers and old victories. They were the ones who let their eyes work as eyes and did not make their eyes into mouths. She liked them and nodded and did not oblige their silence to crack by speaking. They liked her back and called her our knife when they did not know she could hear. On such a night, the gods would felt like a room inside a temple inside a cave in a mountain no man had named. She went because the body demanded it. She drew the longer blade then because the snow's slow hush asked her to move through it not as a soldier but as a phrase. She ran the forms, leaving a script in the thin flakes that fell since the afternoon. On the seventh shape, she felt the wrongness and turned and had the knife at his wrist before the man in the hood had finished imagining himself brave. His breath stank of onion and a lie he had told his mother 30 years ago that he had decided had taught him to be a liar. "Shall we?" she asked, almost polite. He stared at the knife and then at her face and then at the tree as if hoping for a third option. He had a letter tucked into his belt, a letter his stomach had been thinking about while he walked. It made a lump under his clothes like a swallowed coin that had not wanted to go down. She slid it free, not with grace, with efficiency, and stepped back and read it while not taking her attention off the man. He could have made a play for her blade. He did not. He had not wanted to kill. He had wanted to drop a stone into her day and watch the ripples while warming his hands at the fire of his own importance. The letter was nonsense about saltfish and a girl in White Harbor, which told her that the letter was not the letter. She lifted it to the light and saw the faintest other writing, the kind that becomes visible when heat or breath kisses it. She breathed on it and the letters rose like a bruise. The message was not long, because the sender had been careful. "Beware the men who use no coin," it said. "They buy with promise, and a promise cannot be counted in the ledger. They have no faces because faces go to sleep. They carry no names because names can be said too often and worn out. They cannot be taxed. They pay by taking what you cannot put back. Their ship kisses the land like a thief." Arya folded the letter and folded the man with it. She let him sit. She did not strike him, much to his surprise and maybe his disappointment. "Did you know what you carried?" she asked. "No," he said. He had not expected to be asked that, and the truth returned to his mouth like an old bird that still knew the way to the nest. "I thought it was a game." "There are games," she said, "that use real knives." She took the smallest of her blades from her boot and placed it in his palm. He flinched like a child and then held it because he had been given a thing and not forced to take it. "If you wish to play games, use a blade where the cutting can teach you something. Go to hell. Tell him you have been told to offer your back and your time for his apprentices. He will have you cut leather for a week and then throw it away and have you cut it again. When you are sick of cutting, and that sickness has finished with you, stop carrying letters you cannot read." She took the letter back. It had not been his to begin with. He looked as if she had broken him in a clean way and was trying to decide whether the break made him more true. "All right," he said. "Go," she said. And he did, like a boy who had been allowed to keep his toys and did not know why. She took the letter to Sansa, who read both layers and lifted her eyes not with fear but with a certain calculation that would have made their mother proud and perhaps a little sad. "We cannot fight men with no faces," Sansa said, and Arya watched the thought circle and land. "We can fight the promises. We can choose which promises to permit inside the walls, and fishing ships do not come in winter unless they mean to drink soup in our hall. We will not offer soup to strangers without knowing the name of the man whose mother taught him to hold a spoon." Arya grinned because the image was perfect. "We will make soup too thick for thieves." "Precisely," Sansa said, and went to her ledger. which was a book that could be brought into court and into the gods would with equal right. They put a watch on the river mouth, though it lay days away, sending men who moved like crows along fences. They called in favors without calling them favors and built friends by calling them by their names. A captain of the guard who had been at sea as a boy put together, from memory, a list of men who could be bribed, not in coin but with blankets, and blankets were harder to count and easier to carry. Arya stood with him while he spoke it aloud, and she could hear how the boy in him had loved the salt and how the man had been forced to marry the land and had learned to be happy without becoming a liar. She touched his elbow when he faltered. He did not cry, and she was grateful he did not make her act as if he had. In the midst of all this, ordinary things demanded their portion of attention and got it. The pony lost a shoe. He limped and looked offended by his own body. She sympathized. She brought him to Hal, who swaged and snorted and told her to hold the pony's head and teach him to be still and brave while his hind foot was raised. And she found this harder than any 100 cuts. She held the animal's face and spoke nonsense, and the nonsense made sense because it was spoken into the warm area behind the ear where animals store the voices of those who love them. The shoe was replaced. The pony stamped and then forgave everyone. He laid his head against her chest with the weight of a friend who knows he may. She stepped back and wiped an eye because dust had gotten into it. With the day turning, she took a practice blade and asked the captain to meet her in the yard with his men. Not to demonstrate her superiority, but to demonstrate a certain idea. If a man who believed he knew everything could be surprised safely in the yard, he might be less surprised dangerously on the wall. They stood in a ring. The men watched with the slight, private contempt that men who have survived cultivate against the idea that a woman's lessons might undo them. 3 breaths, she said. How much work can be done in 3 breaths? A few laughed. She lunged. Not at the captain, at the air near his right shoulder. He moved by instinct the way a man moves when he believes someone prettier wants to pass and he has learned politeness. She passed and by the 3rd breath had touched the back of his knee and the place at his wrist where a thin scar lived from childhood and the seam at his collar where a blade would deny him his voice. She stopped. He looked, embarrassed at nothing Arya had done but at the part of him that had agreed to be fooled by 3 breaths. She stepped back and invited him to return the lesson. He did, and she let him, and then she showed the men how to read 3 of their own breaths and how much movement can be coaxed into them if you stop treating breath like a luxury and start treating it like a rope. The ring of men did not applaud. They did not laugh. They talked among themselves afterward like men in a bookshop, putting their fingers on spines and pretending they had read every book. Later she saw 2 of them in the corridor repeating the 3 breaths with their heads down, as if praying. She smiled where they could not see. When the ice first sang, when it made that high, glassy noise that makes people hold their breath whether or not they intend to. She was with Sansa in the counting room, called so even on days when nothing was counted and both women simply sat because a day must have a place where it can put its weight down. The sound went through the stone like a thought. Sansa lifted her head. "The pond," she said. They went not because a pond needs watching but because people need to be seen watching a thing they have decided is dangerous so that they will think twice about making it into a novelty. Children had gathered. The ice had not learned itself yet. Arya looked to see which child would fall through if allowed. She saw her. None of the obvious ones. Not the brash boy who had come to watch girls slip. Not the sturdy girl who wished to show her mother how sturdy she was. A small child with hair like fog and hands like a squirrel's, wide, sneaking, tentative. The child had lost a brother last winter and had almost learned caution but not yet. Arya moved not to the child but to the place the child would be. She stepped into the story in the spot where it would need her and stood there looking like an ordinary person doing nothing. The child unconsciously arrested her own momentum to go around this woman-shaped obstacle. The ice cracked where she would have placed her foot. The crack sang again. The child saw it, saw herself in it. Her face, how to describe the way a child's face learns. Went from open to close to open again, but the last open was a different open, wiser by an hour. Sansa spoke to a mother quietly, calmly. The child picked up a stick and wrote her name in the snow, then rubbed it out, then wrote it again with a flourish. Arya put a hand to the place in the air where a name must be set down, and the air felt warmer for a second. There were letters. There are always letters. One came from a woman in the rills who had made herself the head of a small place because no man had survived who could do it better. She asked for steel and for wisdom. She offered dried apples and a list of the names of her dead, as if making room in Winterfell's hall for those names would buy her 100 nails. Arya and Sansa read the list together and did not stop, and when they had finished they felt as if a child had been carried down a mountain between them. They sent the steel and the apples came and were softer than expected, and still good. On a night when the snow fell with a professional's admire, Arya dreamt of wolves. Her wolves, the ones that had been a long time ago and perhaps still were, in other shapes. In the dream, she stood in the yard and the wolves moved through men without doing them harm, brushing their coats with sides and making everyone stand taller without saying why. Nymeria was there and wasn't the way a dream allows. Arya woke with a part of her tear wet and felt no shame. She went to the wall. The stars were not generous. They were cold gods counting. She counted back, an old child defying her elders. A white shape moved below, and for a second she thought of Ghost, but he belonged to another. This shape was smaller and clever and belonged to itself. It lifted its nose and smelled the new fortress of a world made by its own steps. She lifted her hand without thinking. The wolf did not come. It did not need to. The acknowledgement was enough. They had work each of their own kind. On the 5th day after the letter with no coin, a ship was seen where ships had no business. Not in the river mouth. It would have been generous to call that a mouth at this time of year, but beyond, anchored in a look that could be mistaken for patience if you had never been patient yourself. Men without faces often do not hide their faces at all. It is numbers and sameness that are their disguise. She had the captain put the watch in places where a man who disliked being watched would be unable to get away from it without acting like a man who disliked being watched. She chose men who had learned not to scratch when they itched and women who had learned to tell a child the truth without breaking the child. And she put them where a promise would have to walk to enter the gate. The promise came in the shape of a man who had made himself into a handsome ledger entry. He wore a cloak like a compromise and boots that had seen neither war nor farm work. He smiled without contempt, which is always worse. Contempt can be anticipated. He came on foot from where a man had put him shoreward, and he carried nothing, which is to say he carried everything in his mouth and in the way he arranged his shoulders. He introduced himself as if the name were a gift to the cold. "I bring offers," he said, just outside the gate, to the first person who did not matter. Arya had arranged that such honor would fall to a woman named Rika who was 60 and had to sit if she stood too long. Rika looked at him and spat a little to the side. "We make our own," she said. "Offers and tea and trouble." He smiled again with the effortless sunlight of a man who has always found a way to be permitted. "Lady Stark," he began, when at last he stood before Sansa and Arya on a day when there was no hall-braggart in earshot to make the air sticky. "I come with nothing but good." He did not mention the coin. Wise. The good. Salted cod in barrels that did not leak. Cordage. A barrel of preserved lemons. A vanity and yet useful for scurvy, and Sansa liked the taste. A suggestion of cloth. "We ask little in return," he said. "If you have steel to spare, or men who know how to fell trees. Our masters are generous even in winter." "Your masters," Sansa said mildly, as if tasting the word and approving its tone, not its meaning. "The sea is master enough." She glanced at Arya, who tilted her head because the angle of a head can be a question. The man saw it and answered, mistaking courtesy for invitation. He would have done just as well in a different hall, where comfort encourages mistakes. "We are not pirates," he said, anticipating a fear she did not possess. "We are traders of a sort." "Of a sort," Arya repeated. "What sort is that?" "The sort that carries news," he said, smiling again at what he believed would seduce. The idea of knowing more than the next man. "There are movements in the south. A lord with an old name is making himself new. A knight with a newer name is proving himself in tournaments. A queen somewhere grows weary of the stories told about her and writes new ones. We have winter," Sansa said. "She is crown enough." He adjusted, as men like him do, by switching to kindness. "We heard of mice in your granaries," he said softly. "We have cats." It was ingenious, and Arya admired the lying with its kernel of truth. "Mice do love granaries. Cats do kill mice. But you do not buy cats that do not know whose barn they belong to." "We have cats," Arya returned, without malice. "You have cats that are not trained," he said, pushing the knife in under the mail. "We train them." "They train us," Sansa said, arranged her ledger closed very delicately, and the knot merchant did not notice that she had closed the door. He tried once more with the coin he did not produce. "We have a way of buying that does not insult. It leaves no stain. It goes unrecorded. No one need know what you needed, only that you got it." Arya smiled then in a way she had learned from men who could take apart an engine and put it back together without losing any screws. "There is only one way to buy without a record," she said. "It is to steal. I am old-fashioned. If we need stealing done, we will do it ourselves." He laughed. Forced now and pressing against a wall he had discovered was real. He bowed and bowed properly. He had learned that much from traveling. "As you like," he said. "The offer is open. We will be nowhere you can see, and everywhere you cannot." It was meant to make them feel small. It made her feel very steady. When he was gone, Sansa looked at Arya and Arya looked at Sansa, and they both thought of blank coins and the way a promise smells when it has been in someone's boot for a long time. "Cats," Sansa said. "Cats," Arya agreed, and they both laughed because laughter is not a choice. It is a rope thrown across a gap. When the ship left, it did not leave in a way that could be read by men who think only in the language of sails and ropes. It did not even leave. It moved along the edge of the world like a long, dark sentence whose end had not come yet. And all at once she understood that the battle would be not on the wall but in the hall, against the allure of uncounted debt. She understood something else, too. She felt a measure of pride that she did not need to be ashamed of. That Winterfell was in the hands of a woman who could look at a ledger and a liar and put both in their places without breaking either. That night, for the first time since the first day she had arrived, Arya took out the blue cloth. She had carried it as a child carries a charm, against an unknown malady. She unfolded it, and it smelled faintly of soap and of the old woman in the market who had sold it and kissed her with her eyes. She threaded a needle and made a seam along one edge, not because it needed a seam, but because a seam would keep her hands from cutting at ghosts. She made the line straight. She pricked her thumb once and licked the blood and did not moan about it. She finished and folded the cloth into a long band and wrapped it around her waist and tied it, afraid for a foolish half-breath that it would make her foolish, and then laughed at herself because cloth is cloth and she is a person. She went to sleep with it like a small ocean at her middle and dreamed of a man sharpening a stick and a girl in a hall making soup thick and true. The next crisis had no proper name. People from the hills arrived with more bones than flesh and carried on their backs packs of possessions that did not add up to a life. Winter is a collector of people. With them came a different kind of difficulty, the kind where the work is not to decide who lives but to decide how everyone will live lower and be generous without becoming beggars. Sansa set the ledger aside and built a new one that contained fewer numbers and more names. Arya stood at the gates with the guards and put her hand on each person as they came in. This is wasteful, some would say. It is not wasteful. You learn the temperature of a human that way, and the honesty of their breath, and whether the hands have done killing or are simply tired. She allowed in those who should be allowed, sent 3 back with food and blankets because their eyes were wrong. The word wrong is a poor word. The eyes had a fever of something other than sickness in them, something she had seen by strange fires before, the delight of those who bring a rumor of plague in their clothes. One who came was a woman with black hair. She had cut herself into a jagged crown. The woman carried a baby who had no hair at all and a silence that was like sleep in winter, dangerous if left too long. Arya touched the baby's cheek and felt the cold make its case. "Hot," Arya said to the guard. "What?" He did not hear because he was busy thinking of his own child and how the bread had been thin last night. "Hot water," she said, and he moved because her tone did not permit the alternative. They brought it. She warmed cloth and warmed the baby and warmed her own hands and did what a father had once done for her. Breathed slow and steady and made her breath the metronome the baby could learn to keep time to. The baby agreed. The woman looked like a person who had been cut by glass in her sleep and did not know how. Arya looked up at her and said, "You will sleep here," and pointed to the warmest corner of the hall. So warm, it felt like stealing. "You will wash when water can be spared. You will eat more than you wish to. You will be troubled by kindness. It will pass. Then you will work. There will be mending and there will be firewood and there will be singing if you do not sing badly. After that, we will talk about the rest." The woman nodded and nodded again because her mind had been given a line on which to walk. There was a moment later that night when the hall grew noisy, not with laughter, but with the protest of men who were discovering that the humility required to live among strangers was heavier than their pride. Arya stood, bowl in hand, and did nothing. The protest found no echo. Ansa cleared her throat. The protest died. Later, Arya moved among the men as if she were seeing about spoons and touched a shoulder here and a shoulder there and whispered a word in one ear. And the men quieted properly, and not because they feared being seen to be loud by someone who counted such things. The hall became a chorus again of contented small sounds. A bent head being raised, a spoon struck gently against a bowl, the sign of a hand in air telling a child, "Slow, don't choke on your stew." In bed, she allowed her mind to return to the stick and to the man whose absence was now a habit. She wondered if he slept by the stream or if he had built a wall against the wind. She imagined him waking at the black hour and half drawing the white blade and telling it no, like one tells a stubborn child, with love and with finality. She wondered if he stood sometimes and watched the few people who came through his little place and measured them by how they spoke to water and to birds. She did not imagine him coming to her. She imagined walking to him. She knew she would. Not today. Not while winter taught its lessons. Later, when the world had learned enough, she would walk south with a pony that had died and been replaced and a blue cloth around her waist, and she would say thank you in person in the way that matters, by showing him a day that had become something worth seeing. Cats appeared as if in answer to the joke. Rika's grandchild had a way with them. He brought two in the sleeves of his father's old coat. They were not professional cats. They were disreputable creatures with nicked ears and long histories. They slipped from his sleeves, looked around with the hauteur of small gods, and then went to work as if a bell had rung in a church they respected. The granary discovered it could be cleaner. The cat discovered it could be fatter without losing its style. The boy discovered he could be useful without shouting. Arya discovered that sometimes the right answer to a complicated problem is too many ordinary cats. A week later, she stood again with the captain outside the armory to watch the boys too young and the men too old pretend to not want to enjoy practicing. She did not make them boring practice. She set them into the circles and lines and watched them complain, and then watched them become interested despite their complaining. She hung the rope and let the knot swing. One boy took it in his face because he believed that a blow that was due him should land to keep filial piety alive. She took him aside and taught him how to permit a blow and how to deny it, and when to do which, and he understood a thing about fatherhood he would decades later make into a kindness for a son. Sometimes she sparred with a man larger than any she had worked. She learned the feel of a body meeting a bigger desire. She learned to turn it. She watched the bigger desire learn humility, which is the only diet some men can live on without starving. She let them brag later about how bruised their arms were and did not correct the bragging. It served. Snow light, what to say about it? It is not like any other light. It comes from everywhere at once and makes no object into an enemy of another. She stood once under that light and saw her shadow not at her side but under her feet, and understood that to stand was to be the only thing darker than the world for a moment, and that was acceptable. She let the understanding sit in her bones. On a gray noon, a figure came she never expected and yet should have expected, as one expects the next beat in a story that is not finished. A young woman with a bow across her back and a face that had been trained to give nothing. The bow was too fine for the coat. The coat had been mended by someone careful. The cap did its best. Arya saw something in the way the woman looked at the walls, at the gate, at the faces of men who look at women, and she recognized the calculations. She met her at the midpoint, between the door and the yard, which has a different smell in winter, meat and iron and a little sadness. "I am told," the woman said without preface. that there is work here for those who can keep their own swords from finding mischief. She did not touch the bow when she said sword. That told Arya more than any letter of introduction. The woman's left cheek bore a salt-white line where a knife had signed its name and been refused the rest of the story. "I have kept mine quiet for 2 years," she said. "I can keep it quiet another winter. I can teach boys to not shoot their feet." Arya looked at Sansa, who had come without seeming to come, and Sansa looked at the woman and saw her not as a problem to solve but as a future to invite. "Your name?" Sansa asked. "Talia," the woman said, "and if it wasn't, it would be." "Talia," Arya said, "if you can teach a boy to not shoot his foot, you can stay for a long time. There is stew. There is a place by the third hearth. No one will ask where you were before unless you wish to tell them. If you came here to be a story, the door is behind you. If you came to make one, the door is open." The woman breathed out, a breath she had been holding since the sea, or since she had learned to hold her breath to survive the men who had taught her the wrong things. She nodded. She went to the place by the third hearth like a person who had never loved a chair before. News from the south continued in fits and starts, never reliable, always anxious to be thought urgent. There was talk of a tournament. Arya had learned how to put tournaments in a part of her mind where they did not make too much noise. There was talk of a prince who had distributed bread in a square. She put princes in the same part, though more gently. There was talk of a winter that did not care about princes, that she listened to. One night, when the sky was so clear it seemed you could taste the salt of stars, she found Sansa on the wall with a cloak wrapped twice about her and her hair plaited for war with the wind. They did not talk for a while. The stars had arranged themselves as a story for someone else. "I think sometimes," Sansa said, "that we are only buying days. I hope I am wrong. I am content to be wrong." Arya considered the sentence and the place that would hold it in her. "We are buying days," she said, "but each has a different price. We learned today how cheap it can be to be kind to a poacher. Tomorrow we will learn again. It is the only currency that holds value." Sansa smiled, and the smile was not the smile anyone but a sister would see. "You speak like father," she said. "Only when it is useful," Arya said. "Else I speak like myself." Sansa leaned against the Merlin. "You know," she said, "that there are those who will try to make you into a story. They will not stop. They will carve you on their breath. I will be required to let some of it happen, for the sake of being believed about other things." "I know." Arya put a hand to the stone. It was cold even through the glove. "I will cut the story when it grows too long." "I will hold the page," Sansa said, and there it was, the shape of the work between them, not fragile, not grand. It rested comfortably on the stone between their hands and steamed with their breath. The next morning, a man from the Dreadfort arrived without his dread. He had walked, he said, his boots agreed. He had a field look about him, a man who had traded cold for growing things and then been asked to trade back again. He had seen a man hanged from his own door by men who wore no colors and had no leader you could point at from the back of a horse. He wanted to fight. He wanted to be allowed to make someone, somewhere, unhappy in the way he had been made unhappy. Arya listened. She did not tell him that he could not be given his chosen medicine. She told him that his medicine was wrong. She showed him woodwork that needed done and how to do it with a knife that could be turned toward throat or toward line. He did it. He repeated it. 3 days later, he cried in the yard's corner like a man who had found a field in winter and been allowed to plow it. She pretended not to see. He pretended not to be grateful. They both preferred it. The blank coin men were not finished. They began to show their faces in other ways. A letter arrived sealed with wax so pure you could eat it. Contained only one line. "The price of salt rises where snow falls," it said, and it was either a threat or a tautology. Arya sent Talia to the river mouth with 2 good men and a woman who looked harmless and was not. She told them to measure names, not prices. They came back with the list. It contained 4 men who were dependable and 2 who would sell the bones of their own hands if the price was offered cleverly. She sent blankets to the 4. She sent a blanket to each of the other 2 as well, after she had them watched, because blankets can make men less traitorous if applied before the decision. At the forge, Hal grew old in a way she did not like to see. He hid it poorly. He had always been a man built of habits, and now the habits took on daggers at their ends and cut the corners of his days. She brought him broth without speaking to him, as if he were dying. He accepted it and pretended the acceptance was a gift to her. She stood with him while he showed her how to sharpen a blade and leave a whisper of a burr on it so it bit kinder. "Your hands," he said abruptly, as if angry at something not in the room, "have not failed you, because I have not asked them to do everything," she said. He nodded and his breath stuttered because that word had been waiting for him. She walked through the kennel, and the dog who had loved only the boy now loved her more than he should, and she told the boy to take him home. The boy said that a sword needed a dog because a sword cannot smell lies and a dog can. She told him that a sword can learn to listen to a dog, and that was better. He looked at her as if she had told him he could fly if he jumped from the right wall. She did not disabuse him. Some boys must jump. She did not forget the South. Her ears rearranged themselves to hear news. A man from Starfall appeared in the way men appear in winter, without ceremony and with hands that did not give away what they had held before. He had the posture of a person who had learned to make himself invisible by being unremarkable. He asked to speak to the Sword of Winterfell. He had ridden long, and his horse had rolled in the snow and looked pleased with itself. Arya took him to a warm corner. He did not sit until she did. This told her he had learned courtesy from a woman. When he spoke, he did not say Arthur's name. He spoke of a keeper without a keep and a blade that had learned to be returned more gently than it had been given. He told her that the house of Dayne had argued with itself and found manners. He told her that there was a young woman who had learned to not wear her inheritance like a helmet. He told her about stars, and she knew then that he had slept in a certain shadow and had been taught how to do so without turning into a myth. "He told me," the man said, looking at his hands, because sometimes to look at a woman while you say the truth is to break the truth into ordinary pieces, that he had met a girl who came from winter and had left him with no word but work. He wanted to send his blessing, but blessings are dangerous, he said. He sent instead a memory. "I was asked to say the word to you and to no other." He did not adorn it. He said it like a man who had held it in his mouth too long and did not want to make it into saliva. Again. Arya felt it strike, the word that had been the rhythm of the slot and of the leaves and of the rope and the knot, the word that could start any day and could end any argument. She put a hand to her middle because the blue cloth had warmed there, and the warmth answered. "Again," she said, Alu. As one would answer the old gods in a language that is mostly winter. The man nodded and then slept sitting up, and she let him because some sleep must not be disturbed even for comfort. The next morning she took needle and the longer blade and stood in the yard and said the word again without saying it, and the men saw her say it anyway, and their bodies responded because the body recognizes certain summons without translation. She ran the forms until her sweat froze and thawed and froze again, and the forms did not become habit, they became prayer. When she finished, she did not bow. She looked toward a place not visible from Winterfell and nodded once, and allowed herself the pleasure of imagining an older man doing the same somewhere with water and gulls instead of snow and crows. It went on. Work does. You put your hand on the day and the day allows it or it does not, and you learn to recognize which kind you have before you. Sansa built a system for the blankets that used people's pride instead of fighting it. Talia made an archery yard where no one lost an eye. The boy with the ledger grew heavier in his chair and lighter in his hand and looked at numbers the way a captain looks at clouds. The kennel boy taught his dog to pretend not to love Arya as much as he did, and the dog pretended well and then failed, and no one corrected his failure. A fire began where fires begin, in the mind of a careless man, and wanted to become a story. Arya became quicker than the fire and did not let it. She brought water. She brought men. She brought a kind of voice that cannot be argued with because it does not contain any insult. She watched the roof be made of steam and then of smoke and then of nothing. She watched a section of wall drink the water and try to remember which element it belonged to. After, there was a smell of loss that takes days to pay off. She stood with the man whose carelessness had hired the fire. She did not strip him of his dignity. That would have hired other fires. She told him to guard the char for a week until snow covered it. "You will know something at the end," she said, and he did. Later, she heard him tell a boy about the way embers pretend to be asleep. She did not smile where anyone could see. She went hunting once, not for sport, for instruction. She took Talia, who moved like a word said under breath. They moved through the trees, and the trees have different conversations in winter. The air tasted like tin sometimes, like apples at others, as if someone had sliced one in half in a kitchen far away, and the smell had walked here to find the two women. They found deer sign and left it in peace. They saw a fox and did not shoot it. They saw men and did not let the men see them, because sometimes what men need most is to be allowed to be without witnesses. They returned with nothing and ate soups and bread without apology. Men asked if the hunt had failed, and she said, "We went hunting for quiet and found it." And the men laughed and were made more careful by the answer. The time came when someone's blood must be spilled because the math required it. A man had done something you must not do even in war. He had hurt a child in a way that breaks something that cannot be made again all the way true. And he had done it because he had learned long ago that no one would stop him if he chose his moment in darkness. Darkness had believed it owned the night. Arya took him into the yard at dawn. She told him what he had done, and he denied it, and the denial fell out of his mouth like a rotten tooth. She did not make a speech. Speeches before executions make a meal of regret and serve it for the pleasure of the executor. She said his name, and he wept at hearing it given correctly one last time. She did not use the long blade. She used a short one so that the work was closer to her hand, and then she washed the knife as if it were any tool and went into the godswood and stood. She did not ask to be forgiven. She said the truth to the old tree. "It was necessary," she said, "and I hate that it was necessary. It will be necessary again." The tree did not say she was wrong. The wind did not congratulate her. She breathed and let the breath go where the cold wanted it. After, the child's family brought bread that had been braided like hair and was sweet as if meant for celebration, and they stood in the hall and did not know where to put their hands. And she took the bread and broke it and ate. She told them the thing that their bodies wanted to hear, that their sorrow had been seen and honored. She did not say the other true thing, that sorrow does not need to be told what it is. Sansa did the saying in the way Sansa does, which is like making a bed you know will be slept in by the next person to come through the door. Someone asked later, when the hall had softened again and the bowls had been washed and stacked and the women had gathered in a little knot to talk about herbs and bedding and the impossibility of choosing a man worth the winter's trouble, whether Arya ever grew tired of carrying a sword that could not be set aside even to sleep. She said, "Yes, because she is not a liar." She said, "I am not alone, because she is not a fool." She looked to where Sansa stood writing a list with her thumb, and the boy with the ledger had one finger down the page, and a child was sleeping near the heat of a kettle. And she thought, "This is a sword too, and this, and this." And other days came and did not announce themselves as important and were. The first time Talia laughed in the yard at something a boy had said that would have been offensive if not funny. The second time the cat brought a rat and laid it at Ricka's feet, and Ricka scolded it for bleeding on her shoe and then fed it cream. The day Hel rode off a mile to the place where the snow eels still live and returned with a basket of them and cleaned them with a tenderness that would make a young woman jealous, and cooked them with onions and a questionable potion and fed them to the entire lower hall and made them all swear secrecy or else all the eels would be gone next week. A day arrived like any other day except that at noon, the sun set its shoulder on the lip of the sky and rested there as if thinking. An old woman with eyes the color of the inside of a shell came with a story about a man who lived under ice. She told it in the yard because stories freeze indoors. She said the man had learned to walk in the cold like a creature made of cold, and he was coming with a promise of no promises. Arya listened and did not attach this story to any others. There are always men under ice. There are always women with eyes made of shell. She counted the knives, and she counted the blankets, and she counted the breaths, and she counted again. And then she sat on the parapet, above the yard that had taught her how to stand, and watched as snow fell in exactly the speed you would choose for a reading aloud. The stones did what stones do. The doors allowed air. The dogs decided things. The men and women did work worthy of being called work. She thought of Arthur standing by a stream where water touches stone and asks the stone questions and whether it knows it is teaching. She thought of the word that had come to her in a mouth not his and how it had lit a candle in her. She thought of the way Sansa held a ledger and a people at once without breaking either. She thought of the blue cloth and how it had ceased to mean anything separate and become simply part of how her breath stayed where it belonged. She thought of a child writing her name on snow, and of a cat professional at its labor, and of the man in the yard who laughed like rain when she told him he did not have to pick a fight with winter every morning. Winter would come to him without invitation. Work. It gathered to her and around her and through her. It asked for more. It offered more. It would become what it had to when the blank coin men returned in spring with prettier promises and fewer teeth. It would become what it must when the river freed itself and fishing barges slapped like tongues against the current and men came drunk with survival to the gates. It would harden when a white day came with no sound but the old sound of men who had forgotten how to speak kindness and had to be taught anew. It would soften when a baby found breath and when an old man's last breath did not scandalize anyone. It would be the sword she had promised at the tree, not carried in hand but in purpose. It would be enough when she woke while the stars were not yet certain, and she would stand, and when she slept and dreamed a knife hanging above a stream, and she would wake and tell it no with love. Again, she said aloud to no one, to Winter, to the yard, to her sister in a room counting, to a man under a far sky, to herself. She stood. She walked the wall. She felt the knife cool at her hip and the longer blade warm where it crossed her back and the blue cloth a small sea at her middle. She thought of the day after this one and the one after that and the one after that, which was the truest way she knew to pray. Snow stung her eyes and she did not blink fast. She let it do what it did and she did what she was there to do. She stood. She watched. She stepped where not to be and was there. She kept the promise she had made to the house and to the tree and to herself, which is always the hardest person to keep a promise to. And the day, for all its cold, felt held.